Lord Rooker.
My Lords, I beg to move the motion on the order paper in my name. Can I say at the outset how pleased I am to notice that Lord Deben and Baroness Brown of Cambridge are on the speakers list. Global warming is the ultimate world crisis with specific national dimensions. A warning 30 years ago spoke of the insidious danger of the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, the oceans, to the earth itself, by degrading land surfaces, polluting water, adding greenhouse gases at an unprecedented rate. It's mankind changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. That was Margaret Thatcher at the United Nations in November 1989, and I recommend noble lords a read of the entire speech. More recently, in 2006, the specific dangers were spelt out in a government commissioned report, and I quote, that all countries will be affected by climate change, but the poorest countries will suffer earliest and most. That climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen, and crucially, the benefits of strong early action considerably outweigh the costs. That was the Stern review conducted by the then head of the Government Economic Service, Sir Nicholas Stern, now the Noble Lord, in his substantial review on the economics of climate change. It included a host of recommendations: carbon pricing, technology policy and energy efficiency. Well, Lords, carbon emissions are made by all countries. The top emitters are China 30%, United States at 15%, the EU 28 at 10%, India 7%, Russia 5%. That is, 2/3 of global emissions come from the top 5 emitters. I fully accept, looked at per capita, or emission intensity, or cumulative emissions, the order changes, but not fundamentally. It is clear that the large emitters will need to reduce very substantially to affect the global situation. In this month's Journal of the Institution of Engineering Technology, and I declare over 50 years membership, there is a worrying article asking, is China returning to coal-fired power? It's based on a recent study by Global Energy Monitor, Boom and Bust 2019, which indicated that while for the 3rd year in a row the number of coal-fired plants under development worldwide dropped steeply, and the coal plant retirements continue at a record pace, there is a glaring exception in China. It's claimed that observation by satellite shows developers have quietly restarted construction on dozens of suspended projects. The China coal capacity cap has been reset at 1,300 gigawatts. This would allow an extra 290 gigawatt capacity, more than the entire fleet of the USA at the present time. The report warns that global climate goals cannot be met without a full halt to new coal plants and rapid retirement of existing operating plants. The Sierra Club, a US environmental organisation with over 3 million members, says the US is on course to phase out coal by 2030 and transit to a clean energy economy. However, it is the case that more than half the world's new oil and gas pipelines under construction are in North America, the bulk in the United States. The authors of the Global Energy Monitor point out these pipelines are locking in huge emissions for 40 to 50 years, when the scientists say we have to move in 10 years. So it's a worrying story from the 2 large emitters. The UK started all this, of course, with the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, the UK is a low emitter on the world scale, but we are part of the 3rd largest emitter. And the UK will remain part of the European Union integrated electricity market, so we have responsibilities from an historical perspective as well as to the next generation. How are we doing? Well, the science is world class. I'm not so sure about the performance. The scorecard against Lord Stern's recommended actions does not look great. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its special report in October last year, is the wake-up call. The problem is, of course, it might be the final call. We're only 11 years away from 2030, which is a tipping point. It is considered the main consensus that if the temperature rise is not limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030, there will be long-lasting and, in some cases, irreversible changes to the planet's ecosystems. And to achieve this requires rapid and far-reaching changes for all society. It requires faster development and application of new technology, as recommended in the Stern report, now followed up, I'm pleased to see, of course, by today's publication of the Climate Change Committee report. We cannot rest on the fact we were the first nation with a Climate Change Act with legally binding targets. We in the world continue to have population growth. We have doubts about new nuclear build for clean energy, which must carry the baseload in the future, even if we maintain gas with carbon capture and storage. We've abandoned wind-generated power on land. Energy efficiency via insulation is less than what it was. We have given planning permission for a new coal mine. I'll repeat that. We've given planning permission for a new coal mine. It should be called in and stopped. Listed building consents continue to stop the use of certain clean energy techniques. We continue with the third runway and fracking, on both of which I have changed my mind. I want to be positive, but before that, it's worth mentioning the effects of careless land use have now led the United Nations estimating we have only 60 harvests left before the world's soils are too barren to feed the planet. Michael Gove has said we are 30 to 40 years away, and I quote, from the fundamental eradication of soil fertility. So we need to take urgent heed of the science before it's too late. Young people are taking the science seriously. It's the facts they want, not fiction from vested interests. Earlier this year, I was speaking at a sixth form college lunchtime meeting, and the students arrived apologising to the lecturer for bunking off on the morning, off on strike, as it was a Friday. They'd been out in Hereford city centre campaigning on climate change. They are concerned. My 11-year-old granddaughter asked us to be quiet in the recess while she watched and took notes from David Attenborough's TV lecture on the facts of climate change for her school project. She is worried. An unnamed 10-year-old was quoted in the Times last week as asking the question, and I quote, "If the pollution goes on like now, how long have we got left?" Unquote. A 10-year-old was asking that question. A few days ago, I attended the meeting in Portcullis House to listen to Greta Thunberg. As I listened to this remarkable young woman, I became more and more uneasy. I remembered I moved the second reading of the Climate Change Bill. Her reference to the UK's, and I quote, "very creative carbon accounting," unquote, was powerful. And it doesn't really matter, my lords, what your view of the statistics is and who says what. The fact is, our figures are affected to a great extent by the closure of the old coal-fired stations as ordered by the EU, and that emissions from aviation and shipping are excluded, as are the emissions from our imports. Of course there's been progress, but we are unable to claim really serious changes in many of the issues, including carbon pricing. And where are the waves of new technology for clean energy and the very substantial energy efficiency programmes? The Climate Change Act, which of course started life in your Lordship's house in 2007, was world-leading then, but it now looks a bit modest. I might add 2007 was the year I bought my first diesel car on government advice. The Act allows for shipping and aviation to be included in the targets, so there is flexibility. And after more than 10 years on the statute book, in my view, they should be included. Lord, as I said, I want to be positive. It's not too late. Governments, nations, individuals can all make changes. New technology is the key. And this has to include action on greenhouse gas removal of the gas that's already there, as, for example, is set out in the joint report from the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering. Issues such as forestation of 5% of UK land, restoring the wetlands, and building practice to include wood and cement with carbonated waste. And I understand, although I haven't seen all the details, this is of course covered by the Climate Change Committee today, which we'll hear more about. I think the solutions should be mainly market-driven than flat subsidies, because it's a new kind of economy we need to create, which has to be sustainable. And the new economy, of course, has to be regulated. Therefore, government must play a role. Investment will not flow into new products and new ways of working unless there's confidence in a plan. And here I come to my final point. Climate change does not fit our political system nor the electoral cycle. As the Minister Claire Perry said last week in the Commons, there has been cross-party support and consensus building. In my view, this needs urgent strengthening. We need to fit the political system to meet the challenge up to 2030 at least. The status quo is simply not tenable. In my view, it needs national leadership from a Prime Minister to change the machinery of government, to create a Cabinet Committee to include the three opposition parties, business, finance, agriculture and construction, as a way of locking in actions across the electoral cycle and creating confidence for investment in new products and techniques which are going to affect every home in the land. And of course it needs high-level commitment from opposition leaders as well. Well, Lords, I don't think it's any longer acceptable to hide behind the current excuse avenue of one Parliament not binding another. We need to make some changes. But such a process as I've broadly outlined won't work on its own. And therefore I see a role for a Commission of Climate Action Oversight consisting of, say, 7 members from this House with powers to report to Parliament, the relevant political parties, the public on failures to act by such a Cabinet Committee as I've set out, and its members in the interests of achieving targets and working across the electoral cycle in the public interest. It is only by such changes that are wholly radical, I fully accept, can we get a message to the public that something's different about this. This is not the same as the other political issues that we've dealt with. And I might add, I'd propose that crossbenchers were in a majority on such a commission, because that would give greater force when they're dealing with the other place. The government and the elected House has to be in the lead and give a lead. But too often, and we could cite lots of examples, there is inertia for political and other reasons. And I think an oversight commission from this House with the necessary powers could provide the clout. Well, Lords, I don't intend to take any further time. I'm very grateful for the number of people who are going to contribute, and I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
It's a great pleasure, my Lords, to follow Lord Rooker, and I think he put his finger on the pulse there by saying, I expect we will all make very similar speeches, but it's the action that must take place which will be the judge of what we say today. So for 3 years I've stood here, or I did stand here before I stepped down, as the Lib Dem spokesperson for climate, energy and climate change, and I said over and over and over again that the thing that shocked me most when I came into post was the complete and utter lack of urgency in the government's approach to action on climate change. I said over and over and over, we need to go further, we need to go faster. And I often said that the government appeared to think that signing the Paris Agreement was an end in itself rather than a beginning. And that this government, without the strong leadership on this agenda that we had previously, both during the Labour government with the Climate Change Act and with Ed Davey and Chris Huhne as Liberal Democrat Secretaries of State, and the huge advances we made under their stewardship, has pulled some of the rug from under this agenda. Because by the end of the coalition, we'd made Britain the fastest growing green economy in Europe. The amount of electricity from renewables had more than trebled. We'd set up the Green Investment Bank, which had helped fund up to the change in government, helped fund the change in government, 11 billion worth, up until the change in government, 11 billion worth of green infrastructure projects. And in 2015 we had a record-breaking year with millions of pounds poured into solar and wind energy and more homes powered by nature than ever before. And none of these things would have happened with a Conservative-only government, and we knew this at the time. But since we have had a Conservative government only, within the first 2 years, we've had a shocking list of anti-green measures. I'm not going to repeat the whole litany, you'll be relieved to hear, but the cutting of subsidies precipitously for solar and wind, banning onshore wind, causing thousands of job losses in solar, scrapping the original billion carbon capture and storage project, cutting the renewable heat incentive, pushing ahead with fracking, abandoning the zero carbon homes policy, which was crazy, and on and on and on. And yet I'm sure when the noble Lord the Minister comes to answer this debate, he will list the things the government has done, point to the industrial strategy, claim they are totally committed. But as Lord Rooker said, it's going to be actions that will speak much louder than words. And additionally, we have enemies out there, real enemies out there, climate deniers, and the massive invested interests of giant oil companies. And we have a climate denier in the White House. And make no mistake, other countries are going to use Trump as an excuse not to act themselves. And that wonderful, hard-won Paris Agreement, which gave us so much hope when it presented a united global ambition to tackle climate change, is now under threat, and the global consensus is in danger of unravelling. And the United Kingdom should be leading the charge to net zero carbon. So, thankfully, along come Extinction Rebellion, and we have a moment of opportunity, but it really shouldn't be necessary to bring London to a halt. We have made it clear what needs doing, and it's action. Now, I commissioned work to find a roadmap, what needed to be done to become net zero carbon by 2050, because it's clear that the 80% current target, even if we were to meet it, which looks unlikely, would not deliver the Paris Agreement. Calmer Raphael and Icahn Associates, they're the consultants I commissioned, produced the report. And I know the noble Lord the Minister has read it because he's quoted it back to me by title and content from the dispatch box. A vision for Britain, clean, green and carbon-free, and a huge number of experts in the field were consulted and gave their time and effort. And even if we manage to do everything in that report, that vision for Britain, we get to 93% by 2050. Yes, we can make it to zero carbon, that extra 7% reached by technological advancement. But now we need even more radical action. So what would it take? I was going to say, my lords, close your eyes, but that's always a bit dangerous here. Just imagine, as the ordinary citizen leaves his or her home in the morning, the commute to work has changed radically. In large urban centres, there are carpools of electric cars anyone can rent. There's rental club and car share ownership schemes, they've proliferated. People still occasionally own cars, but they use them far less, and all cars are electric, with charging facilities available from most lampposts. Autonomous cars pick up and drop off house to office and vice versa. Buses, tubes and trains are no longer the cattle trucks of yesteryear, as people timeshare slots in order to share familial roles, with many couples and non-couples sharing the working day. The third runway at Heathrow Airport never happened. A national anti-obesity campaign got everyone to get off their bus, tube, one stop early and walk, and separated cycle lanes are in place on almost all major routes. Houses are carbon neutral, gas-fired central heating, cooking comes from green gas, hydrogen, green electricity, renewable energy is the standard form of energy generation, solar, wind, geothermal, tidal and hydro dominate the market, and prices have fallen dramatically over the last 2 decades. There are now 6 tidal lagoons in operation. Hinkley Point did get built, but with vast public subsidy, coming in at 3 times the original price. But it was to be the last of its kind. Before the construction was completed, nuclear had completely been overtaken by massive changes in the energy market. An urgent and huge uplift in the provision of interconnectors took place in 2019. Fracking turned out to be a disastrous waste of time. The big companies abandoned their efforts as the geology proved too complicated and costly, not to mention the years tied up in local objections. And people finally gained local control of the supply and delivery of their own energy. And every household had its own battery storage and charging facility. It's been years now since carbon had been allowed to get into the atmosphere, as the technology of the 2020s saw capture and storage reach maturity. The exponential growth in renewables created an economic boom of huge proportions, and we are now well on the course to deliver the maximum rise of 1.5% in temperature. Industry cleaned up its act. Agriculture, land use changed. We financed that tradition. We have a vibrant and successful circular economy. The financial institutions of our country changed the investment rules and regulations so that benefits to the planet and mankind were equally regarded alongside fiduciary duty. Exponential perpetual growth was frowned upon, as it was recognised that the world's resources were finite, and people self-regulated their meat-eating and accepted their ration of flying hours per year until the day that aviation became renewable. That's what it will take. Following the publication of our report, I like to think it helped provoke Claire Perry into asking the Climate Change Committee to look at zero carbon, and this morning, 2050, and this morning the CCC launched its wonderful and extensive report on net zero. Britain's future prosperity depends on developing an economy that's innovative, entrepreneurial, internationally open and environmentally sustainable, and where the benefits are shared fairly across the country and with future generations. This is indeed a climate emergency.
My Lords, I declare an interest as Chairman of the Climate Change Committee, and I come directly from the launching of the Net Zero report, which was asked for by the government, the first government in the world to ask for the mechanism by which we meet what we have agreed to do in the Paris Agreement. I am passionate that the most important part of our system is that we have all-party agreement. I'm also concerned lest all-party agreement becomes an excuse for a degree of unwillingness to move fast enough. There is a complacency that sometimes comes from all-party agreement. But I have constantly objected to people who try to make party politics out of this, which is why I objected to the article in the Daily Telegraph by my noble friend who was talking about climate change from the Conservative Party, and why I think that last speech did not contribute to us at all. I don't care who's done it. What I care about is what is done and what is now going to be done. And that is why the Climate Change Committee has today answered the government's request, and it has now got to answer the facts. The facts are we can reach net zero, not net zero in terms merely of carbon, but net zero in terms of greenhouse gases. We can meet it, and we can meet it by 2050. We have made that clear, and the mechanism is there. If the government does not accept it, then it will be saying that it neither accepts the science nor indeed the best mechanism that has ever been produced. This is 600 pages of groundbreaking work which has been already recognised as a total game changer, as important, if not more so, than the Stern report, because it gives us all a real challenge. But it means action now. It does not mean hanging about. And there is a series of things that we have to do. And I'm very pleased about the protesters and the students and the rest, because they are saying to us, you have a responsibility not to destroy our future. I declare another interest, which is 3 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. I want their future to be guaranteed, and it's we who can do that. So that means stop building crap houses which don't give the owners a proper kind of energy efficiency. It means let's have the kind of heating which doesn't need fossil fuels. It means doing something about the appalling situation of our soil. We need to recover the fertility in our soil, because we need it for our farming, but we need it even more to be able to sequestrate the carbon which itself is part of the soil fertility circle. We need to bring into the figures aviation and shipping, and indeed that is what we have insisted upon. There can be no sensible policy if we do not cover all those things. What we do has in fact to be market-driven, because otherwise there will not be strength enough to achieve what we need. But the market itself has to be driven by the terms in which it operates. The government has to make sure that the occupancy advantages do not stop the change which we need. That's a role of government, And regulation is not about the nanny state. It's about ensuring that the needs of the next generation are taken fully into account now, when we can make the changes which are necessary and which we now have detailedly adumbrated in this report. Curiously, the new generation is threatened in a way which is utterly different from the threat which we had in my growth. When I was growing up, we were threatened by the nuclear war. But the nuclear war might not have happened. Indeed, it didn't happen. Climate change will happen. It does happen. It's not a threat in the sense of being something that's possible. It is something that is happening now, and unless we intervene, it will overwhelm us. Now, I'm fascinated, by the way, as I go around the country, that people no longer ask me whether climate change is happening. The deniers have lost the battle because the science is so fundamentally clear. The new battle is not to make people believe in climate change. The new battle is to take the steps that are necessary. We can do them, and we can do them within the financial envelope which Parliament set aside when our aim was 60%, leave alone 80%. So we can do it within the costs we've got today, because government action has brought the prices down of what we need to do, and further government action will continue to do that. So I finish by saying to my noble friend, we don't want fine words. We don't want comments about what we did do, or where it was that the Liberals didn't do what they could have done, or the Labour Party. What we want is a very direct statement. You asked for this report. You've got it. You put it into action.
Yeah. My Lords, I'm very grateful to our noble friend Lord Rooker for introducing this debate so passionately, and we have an even more passionate debate from the noble Lord Deben, whose work on the Climate Change Committee is absolutely central to us getting this right. My Lords, 10 or 11 years ago I served on the Joint Committee of this House on the Climate Change Bill, which brought in the very first legally binding targets. 20 years ago I was working with John Prescott here in his department when he went off to Tokyo and was so instrumental in delivering the Kyoto Agreement. And I'm glad he's been speaking later on today. My Lords, some of those early promises, though, have not been fulfilled, either nationally or globally. Globally, we are not yet on course to achieve anything like 1.5% constraint of growth. It will be significantly worse than that, even if we adopt some of the measures that are going to be advocated today. And nationally, we have had a number of successes, but some of those have been by default. And some of them we have seen the abandonment of policies which were delivering many of them. For example, the premature ending of subsidies to the renewable sector, the abandoning of some of the R&D onto tidal power and carbon capture and storage, the end of an effective programme of energy efficiency in house build and in home insulation of existing buildings, and pulling back on the regulations for new build in this country. We have had some success, but, my Lords, we need to be a little bit cautious about this. My noble friend Lord Rooker referred to Greta Thunberg's assertion. Some people derided that, but essentially she is right. That some of our claims for our progress on this are a bit dubious. In particular, we have effectively exported the carbon emissions from our manufacturing industry essentially to the Far East, and part of China's escalation is because Britain and the rest of the West have moved their dirtier industries into the Far East. Therefore, assessment of demand, including demand for imports, needs to be taken into account when we congratulate ourselves on our achievements in this area. It's also true that the will of government has been clear that we need to do something about this. But the reality is it has gone down the list of priorities. Brexit has dominated our lives. Other things impinge, a housing crisis, social care crisis and so forth. But actually this is the central issue that any government needs to be tackling. And at last the House of Commons yesterday, following the Extinction Rebellion and following Richard Attenborough and following indeed the Noble Lord Deben's report, have declared this an emergency. It was pretty obviously an emergency 20 years ago, and we now need to treat it as such. And to upgrade the actions on climate change within our government machine and within this House and Parliament and within the national consciousness. It has been downgraded and it needs to be upgraded again. I hope I've not had the opportunity to read the Climate Change Committee's report yet. It's a bit long. I'll have a go at it tonight. But I hope that gives us a blueprint as we go forward, and I hope the government take notice of that, because we need some big decisions immediately on the agenda. The decarbonisation of domestic heat, decarbonisation of our transport systems. We've made some progress, but we're still a very small proportion of our transport system is decarbonised. We need to look at developing hydrogen for both those purposes, as well as looking at things which themselves have some environmental impact, as relying on current battery technology. But we also need effective government machinery. We need proper regulations. We need, above all, the effective enforcement of those regulations and compliance with those regulations. I have to say that for all the good words from Michael Gove and others, which I support, when we come to actually proposing the future principles and governance on environmental policy, then A, climate change is not centre stage, and B, the provisions within the proposed bill, which has yet to reach this House, are completely insufficient to ensure that the whole of the public sector, let alone the whole of the economy, is actually prioritising the fight on climate change. I want to use my last 2 minutes to mention two things which have been mentioned but are normally down prioritised. We talk about emissions into the air, but I want to talk about soil and water. On water, the combination of poor management of water, growing heat, less water being available, and the insatiable demand of individuals and businesses for water in our country means that we've got to take much more drastic measures in controlling our use of water. Leakage controls, water efficiency measures, control of the energy content of water infrastructure. And we need to retrofit our own houses and businesses with energy efficiency appliances. And we need better water catchment management in the first place. That needs to be delivered with the industry, but it needs to be delivered very effectively by government intervention as well. And on soil, this is the most frightening thing I have heard. I heard it, actually, the Noble Lord, the Earl of Caithness, has disappeared from the bench, but about 3 or 4 years ago I heard him assert that we only had 50 harvests left in Northern Europe. It's the first time I had heard it, and I followed it up and I read the literature behind it. It is a truly terrifying thing. As Lord Deben's grandsons, all our grandchildren, are going to be within their lifetime, if we don't do something about it, faced with a situation in Northern Europe and probably the globe where the soil does not deliver the food, the biodiversity and the environment in which human life can continue. That is a frightening thought. 50 or 60 years from now, we will no longer be producing from our soil, and that will be because of climate change to a large extent, as well as bad practice over the agricultural practice and land use over the years. So, my Lords, let's put those two back into the equation. Let us ensure the government do take this more seriously. This is an emergency, an escalating emergency, and I hope we act on the Noble Lord Deben's report.
My Lords, the context of this debate has changed radically over the last few months. Whatever you think of the tactics of Extinction Rebellion, that what's been created by their disruption and has put the environment on the agenda in a new way, with greater urgency. The debate in the other place yesterday on a climate emergency was Parliament catching up with more than 40 councils in the UK that have made a decision to act in response to this climate emergency, including Wiltshire declaring to be carbon neutral by 2030. 2/3 of Britons are now said to agree that the planet is in a climate emergency. So I welcome today's publication of the Climate Change Committee's report. Actually, this is a creative opportunity, not just a moment of anxiety. We're in an industrial revolution. I was really taken by Greta Thunberg's comment that avoiding climate breakdown will require cathedral thinking. We must lay the foundation while we may not know exactly how to build the ceiling. The Climate Change Committee has set out the sort of direction and the detail of what it's going to do to respond to that challenge. Net zero is possible and affordable. The costs of climate inaction will be more than achieving net zero. The business opportunities are considerable. We need to get on with it. This is urgent in the short term. The transition to net zero needs to be socially just and the costs fairly distributed. We should not be using international offsets. The UK needs to continue to make firm commitments to developing countries to provide financial, technological capacity building support for their own low-carbon development and resilience building. 2050 is ambitious, but 2045 could well be possible. A virtuous circle to spur greater action can be created by good policy. In the faith communities of the United Kingdom, there's a strong recognition of the need to change lifestyles and behaviours. We welcome the benefits that will follow, including cleaner air and warmer homes. We've already begun to embrace these changes with thousands of places of worship powered by renewable energy and families committing to live simply and sustainably. We need the greatest minds, hearts and souls committed to this task, individuals and communities, businesses and government working together. I share the criticisms of others about some of the things that the government has done or not done, but the government deserves to be encouraged for what it's doing in the right direction. The UK is giving significant leadership, and we have done so with a degree of cross-party consensus. I think that's really important, and I strongly support Lord Rooker's observations about the need to build and strengthen that if we're going to face the greater urgency of the current challenge. There is so much more to be done. Could we agree legally binding a target of net zero emissions by 2045? Such a target would require cross-party approach. In the context of the climate emergency, some decisions of government are hard to comprehend. We need a much more coherent approach to energy. The continuing subsidy of fossil fuels is now absurd and needs to end. The stimulus of renewable energy and of greater efficiency is a priority. The inability to tax aviation fuel or to find a way to limit air travel is just plain stupid. I asked a question of the Noble Minister Lord Henley about the Woodhouse Colliery in Cumbria, and in answering he replied that the government continues to be committed to the Paris Agreement and referred to the request for advice from the Climate Change Committee published today. He went on to say that Cumbria County Council took the decision to grant planning permission, and it was their responsibility to consider the application in its role as Minerals Planning Authority, and the Council would have considered all the relevant material considerations, including the environmental impacts. Odd that, when about fracking, at a local level, decisions can be called in by the government and resolved centrally. We need joined-up thinking and action, and we need policy formation that provides a framework in which individuals make good choices. Lord Williams of Oystermouth said on the eve of the Extinction Rebellion protest that it's as if we have forgotten who we are, and we need to rediscover our relationship with one another, with God and the creation. To live in a revolution is hugely demanding. It will need the commitment of parliamentarians to engage strongly with our communities and to establish creative policy frameworks that get the best out of people not just because of anxiety, but for the love of this wonderful creation. In this, the faith communities are a resource for prayer and thought and action.
My Lords, I declare an interest as Chairman of the Windsor Energy Group and consultant to Mitsubishi Electric. My Lords, we always say these debates are timely. But in this case, it really is timely, not just because of the recent protests and not just because of the mighty new plan presented so eloquently by my noble friend Lord Deben a few moments ago. It's timely because, in fact, we are raising here overdue questions about the whole of UK energy policy and its present trend, and also, of course, about the whole global climate struggle, which, frankly, we, and indeed the whole world community, are now busy losing. My Lords, in my short time, I make 3 points. First, of course, carbon reduction is a central priority. I certainly don't question that. Yes, that is necessary, but some compassion is also needed. It is also a priority to provide affordable, clean energy to the millions across the world who don't even have it, and indeed across the millions in the developed world who have it but face extreme difficulties, and that includes in many parts of our own United Kingdom. It is for me, my Lords, utterly shaming that we are a nation of fuel banks, with agonising choices for some families between heating and eating, and ineffectual energy price caps. My Lords, there is a real choice here, on pace and on balance, to prevent serious social harm and economic damage. And it is callous to ignore or pretend otherwise, and it's also, in practical terms, unwise and self-defeating. We only have to see what happened with the Gilets jaunes in France a few weeks ago to get a good idea of what happens if we get this balance wrong. My second point is this. We face a massive growth of electricity demand worldwide, not least from billions of people without any power at all. The future is electric. My Lords, however successful we are with cheap renewables, plus storage technology, which we must press ahead with, of course, however clever with conservation, or electric cars, or distributed power sources, or carbon capture and storage, or any of the other very desirable technological improvements, the only way to meet this inevitable and huge demand is going to be through low-carbon nuclear power. Everyone knows that. It's being recognised throughout the world. France recognises it. They've decided now to delay their closure of their highly successful low-carbon nuclear electricity system in order to achieve zero emissions by 2050, in line with my noble friend Lord Deben's aspirations as well. It can't be done without keeping open part of their vast nuclear power low-carbon system. Germany is in a complete muddle, having abandoned nuclear power. It now finds it's having higher coal burning. CO2 is actually rising and not falling, and it's ended up 50% dependent on Russian gas, which is highly dangerous. Here, my Lords, in the United Kingdom, we're trying to expand clean nuclear power, but it's not going well. The Hinkley Sea Point is being built with colossal burdens on consumers for years ahead. Wilfer is on hold with Hitachi suspending operations. The Moorside plan is completely halted by the Toshiba abandoning it. The Chinese are taking over. They're going to build their own nuclear plant at Bradwell and possibly at Sizewell C. My Lord, we cannot, and the world cannot, achieve even the present targets without substantially increased nuclear power. All this mess that we've now got into with the British system needs a thorough review, because without the nuclear power we will not deliver the green targets or keep within the legal bounds we set ourselves. My Lords, my third point is this. However well we do here, our climate fate is actually going to be decided in Asia and in the USA, and in China and India in particular. I think the noble Lord Rooker and others have recognised that. The 2018 emissions grew 4.7% in China. In India, it was 6.3%. And with the USA, which is far the biggest per capita emitter, of course, of all, they grew last year by 2.5%, having fallen in earlier years because of the shift from coal to shale gas. Through all this time, the UK has undoubtedly done comparatively quite well with reduced emissions, but the trouble is that not only is it a heavy cost to the poor consumer, but it is only 1% of world emissions. It used to be more, of course, in the industrialization revolution era, much more, but now it's 1%. So our influence on climate change worldwide is only going to be by example. In fact, even if we close down the whole United Kingdom, the direct effect on climate throughout the world and on the battle against climate change would be marginal. 99% of CO2 is pumped out elsewhere from this kingdom. And unfortunately, there's no virtuous little carbon-free zone which would be can maintain above us. It's not like that. We are caught up in the global system. Because of vast Asian demand, as living standards rise, hydrocarbons will still be 74% of energy sourced by 2040. 37% of energy still comes from coal, with many new coal power stations still being built, as earlier speeches have already reminded us. My Lords, the lessons of this are clear. Let there be protest, and let the young and old be motivated, that's fine, but let this protest be focused on real issues, without fantasy, and ideally without hitting and hurting hard-working people, or the vulnerable, or the weak, as I fear some of the measures have already done. Resources should be provided on a Marshall Plan scale to put behind low-carbon technologies which will meet Asia's colossal thirst for power and electricity, including clean coal technologies, and including particularly cheaper nuclear power, and smaller, cleaner and safer reactors may well be the solution here, instead of the expensive behemoths that we keep building here, not with great success. My Lords, without this new focus, there is not the slightest hope of even meeting the inadequate Paris targets. Whatever we do here, legal or not legal, protest or no protest, that is the case and those are the facts. I hope that the government panel on climate change will play its part, dare I say possibly a stronger part than in the past, in bringing honesty and realism to the debate and focusing on the real needs before it is too late. We do indeed need to think again, urgently, sensitively and differently on all these issues.
My Lords, can I offer my congratulations to Lord Rooker for securing the debate, but also for an excellent and the usual inquiring speech that accompanied it. But I want to and also the controversy. There's always controversy as we've gone through climate change, and that was certainly notable at the time when we dealt with the Kyoto Agreement and the negotiations there. Great emphasis by Lord Deben and another excellent speech, and Jeff Rooker, on the whole point of partnership. Can I say one of the first things I did when I was in government and appointed to be the European negotiator for Kyoto was to invite Lord Deben to join our delegation. That was the first example of the last Secretary of State joining the new one to get on with partnership to deliver what is essential about climate change. And I think his speech today shows us the excellent work that has been done by his committee. They have laid down the roadwork for the next stage of this business of climate change and the change to a low-carbon economy. So at Kyoto, of course, that was controversial, but it was all about the science. I see Lord Lawson's not here today, so he must have accepted the science has changed and accepted. But at the end of the day, we have now got no longer the argument about science. The evidence is clear for us, and the public have accepted it. The demonstrations now reflect much more than that. They reflect their anger that we're not implementing what they thought we should be doing and what we've set out. I think they're being unfair in their criticism, and I would say that to Greta also that came along. She wasn't right that things weren't done. A global problem requires a global solution. It requires a global agreement, which is done at Kyoto. It provides a national one that was agreed at Paris. And I might say, as I'll say in some of my speech, we need a regional agreement also, which I tried to implement at the COP in Poland. So to that extent, we've got that framework. I don't think it was right to say nothing was achieved. It certainly was internationally, and Britain did lead the way and continues to do so because of setting up a statutory committee to judge government to actually implement policies to implement what they've said in the cuts of carbon. That's a major change. It didn't happen in any of the countries, and that was at the first stage. So I'm delighted. But where Greta was right was that we're not moving urgently enough or in detail in the policies of which we get from the Climate Change Committee. We need the political judgments to get on with it and implement the policies. Now, in that excellent report, it's quite clear from his report today, controversy will continue. It's about targets, it's about timetables, it's about policies. I don't look forward to a debate going on in the next 20 years, arguing whether we've got the targets, which direction are we going, what needs to be done, did we get 10% or 15%? For God's sake, can we move on from that argument? Because this is an emergency. It's an emergency. We have to do what we promised, probably even more, but that's going to be a lot of problem when you start talking about transport, when you start talking about housing. It's not just about money, it's an essential part of the requirement to get the low carbon down, because we all say rich countries that poison the world with high carbon need to produce low carbon economies. And that means fundamental changes. And what I'd like to see do is to say to the House today that there are things that we can do more than just have the argument for 13 years. You'll still have them, it won't go away. But if we could have something that could provide more proof than their judgments, and I think I would like to propose basically my own constituency of the Humber area. If you look at the Humber Estuary, that is now moving towards one of our great rivers of energy. Why? Because the location of the new industrial revolution, because that's what it is based on wind and water, as the last one was. It went through all its stages based on coal and iron. Now it's about renewable energy. That means you need to have the low costs that come with renewable energy, and you need an estuary to get out. Why? Because the real low costs come from a continental shelf that's out at sea. So if we want to develop the new energy sources, you have to have an estuary to go on. So estuaries provide us a very unique way of beginning to develop to a low-carbon economy. So I would like to say to the government, right, we now must all get together to try and plan, not just rely on the Climate Change Committee. They can show us the way forward. Why don't we produce a living lab? Why don't we have a look at an area that is going to implement that programme? The government talk about an industrial strategy. Right, it's talked about places of growth. Let an estuary become a place of growth. Why? Because it's unique. Not only unique because it's the area that's got all the wind power. I addressed a conference yesterday of 350 people in Hull, where they're today planning the next stage of the growth of the renewable energy. Any new industrial revolution is going to be bound to be on renewable energy. That's got having access to the sea. So the Americans were at this conference because they've recognised now that renewable energy brings with it the technology and the development of the new carbon economy, because this is a new industrial revolution. And that's what we have to get over to people. So to that extent, I think the Humber offers a good opportunity, as I explained in this conference, of where we can now develop estuarial development. And I'm arguing this within the international framework at the present stage. The government have an industrial strategy. They are now saying, mind we're caught up with all the debates at the moment about Brexit, but in that industrial strategy they say there should be places of growth. Let the Humber become a place of growth. We've now got the new source of energy. We've got the land for supplying for the new technologies and supply industry that come from it. We've got the traditional maritime, which are the ports and the fishing, which now service that industry. We've got all the science. We've got a river base that offers mobile water power. to look at. It's an estuary that you need an estuary to get out to the seabeds to get the low energy. So Humber has all that. We've even got holes in the ground for carbon capture. The North Sea industry gas was taken out and pipes were taken to the town. Let us take the carbon capture and dump it back in the North Sea, in the holes that are empty. That's another asset that belongs to an estuary like the Humber. So in that sense, there are many things that we can do. Some we need to identify as carbon. And I think I finish on this point. We have to recognise it's an industrial revolution taking place. It requires certain location factors, all of them to be found in the Humber. So I say to the government, consider and look at the idea of a place of growth is the Humber. Call it the living lab. So when the arguments are going on with the Climate Change Committee, we have something to see whether those policies are working in this new low-carbon industry. It's a practical judge against a lot of the hot air that goes on about targets and timetables. We need to be more practical and be the first step towards the emergency step to deal with the carbon and the climate change problems we have at the moment.
My Lords, I would like to add my congratulations to the noble Lord Rooker on securing this debate, and would like to declare my interest as set out on the register, in particular my work with the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, the Water Regulator for Scotland, and the fact that I co-chair the all-party parliamentary group on water. In setting the scene for this debate, the noble Lord Rooker calls on the government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to respond to the challenge of climate change. My noble friend Lord Deben referred to the role of the Paris Agreement and how to achieve what was agreed there through his Climate Change Committee's report of today. Lord Rooker is absolutely right to press for greater international commitments to match what has been achieved by the UK and Europe. And I'm pleased that he singled out the fact that India and China are the enemies of climate change, and also that we have climate change deniers in the US. May I say that the UK government, successive UK governments, have been pioneers in this regard. The UK was the first country to set a science-led, long-term and legally binding greenhouse gas emission target. We have to accept that science changes, and already the science has moved on. Every household is playing its part with the emphasis on renewables and clean energy technologies, and undoubtedly this has led to higher fuel energy bills. In 2018, the renewables contributed 37% of the UK's electricity supply, and the UK has already reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 25% since 2010. Also, the UK is one of the largest international donors of overseas development assistance, so we are thereby contributing to help developing countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But I do regret, and I echo the words of the noble lady Baroness Featherstone in this regard, I do regret the government's focus and obsession on fracking. There cannot be a surer way to increase our greenhouse gas emissions, and I hope that we will turn the corner and put an end to future prospects for fracking. The conclusions of the Climate Change Committee today are welcome. I congratulate the committee and its chair, my noble friend Lord Deben, for setting out the framework to go forward. I do have one question for my noble friend. Why is it always that those living in the south of England, in largely arable-producing areas, tell us to produce less meat and to turn our heating down? Having represented the upland farmers for 18 years in the other place, I accept that 65% of our land is best suited to grazing animals. I welcome the fact that farmers are committed to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions across England and Wales by 2040. There are always smarter and more environmentally sustainable ways to farm, and farmers are rising to that challenge. Any proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will impact on British business, British consumers and British competitiveness. And that is why I believe that any action should be based on a multilateral, international approach based on initiatives such as that put forward on the eve of the forthcoming Future of Europe Summit to be held on the 9th of May, in the letter by 50 CEOs of businesses based across the European Union calling for the adoption of the European Commission's vision, a clean planet for all. The letter from these top European businesses calls on the heads of state and government to endorse an EU strategy for climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. And I believe that we would do best to support that, whether we remain in the European Union or following Brexit. I do believe that we should follow their lead. Others today have spoken of the great challenge to replace petrol and diesel vehicles with electricity-driven ones, and the need to make air and sea transport more environmentally friendly. Like the noble Lord Prescott, I am fully signed up to what we've achieved in North Yorkshire by planting more trees. And I would hope and would point the Minister towards the Pickering pilot project, the Slow the Flow project, whereby planting trees, creating dams and creating peat bogs that take some 200 years to build, we have actually created a flood defence scheme at the same time as no better way than to capture carbon storage than to plant these trees. And I entirely agree with the noble Lord Whitty that we must push for better catchment management and ensure that any new houses are built in appropriate places, not unfunctional floodplains, with proper infrastructure for resilience, and in particular a sustainable water supply, fresh water in and wastewater out. I would like to end with two questions to the Minister, if I may. By encouraging electric-powered vehicles, I would ask the Minister, from which sources of energy will this electricity be supplied? And if we are all agreed, which has been the main thrust of the debate so far today, politicians, industry, farmers and even school children, will the government ensure that we deliver on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing the challenge of climate change, and that we do so by seeking international action in this regard?
My Lords, I would like to echo the words of others in thanking the noble Lord Rooker for securing this debate on what has turned out to be a very special day. I also declare my interests as Vice Chair of the Committee on Climate Change and Chair of the Adaptation Committee of the CCC. I actually want to talk about the lesser-known part of the Climate Change Act, the part of the Act which covers climate change risk and the actions government must take to address it, to keep the people of the UK safe in the face of a changing climate. And however well we do on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, even if we could cut them to zero by 2025, as Extinction Rebellion would like, or the, I think, much more realistic target that the CCC has recommended today of 2050, we have to recognise that the climate will go on changing because of the lag in the climate system. It will continue to get hotter. The threats of drought and fires will continue to increase. Extreme weather events, such as the short periods of very intense rainfall that cause flooding, will continue to become more frequent. Sea level will continue to rise, contributing more damage to coastal areas. So adaptation, ensuring that people, but also animals and plants, can continue to live safe and healthy lives in the face of these changes, will remain a critical area for policy and for investment and for action. The Climate Change Act 2008, under Section 56, requires the Secretary of State every 5 years to lay a report before Parliament containing an assessment of the risks to the UK of the current and predicted impact of climate change, and to take into account the advice of the CCC. This is the Climate Change Risk Assessment, the CCRA, and our current CCRA, which is our second, was laid before Parliament in 2017. Under Section 58 of the Act, the Secretary of State has a duty then to lay programmes before Parliament, setting out the objectives of Her Majesty's Government in the UK in relation to the adaptation to climate change, the Government's proposals and policies for meeting these objectives, and the timescales for introducing these proposals and policies, addressing the risks identified in the most recent Climate Change Risk Assessment. This is called the National Adaptation Programme, or the NAP. And we on the CCC review the progress on delivering the NAP every other year. Our current NAP was laid before Parliament last year, and we will review it formally later this year. The CCC's advice to government on climate change risks, based on an extensive evidence report, identified 56 key risks and opportunities for the UK which should be addressed in the next 5 years. 38 of these were classified as more urgent, i.e. where more action or in some cases more research was needed in the next 5 years. And in our first scan of the 2018 NAP, the CCC has already pointed out that half of the 55 key risks are not covered by formal NAP actions, and that includes 16 of the risks identified as more urgent. I'm not going to list these because we will cover these in detail in our formal report in the summer, but I do want to highlight those which are particularly pertinent to the subject of this debate, which are the international aspects and the international risks which include global stability and the global economy. Climate change, as we've heard, will impact populations, economies and livelihoods around the world. An increase in extreme weather impacts can be expected to cause widespread loss of life and severe humanitarian crises. Patterns of agricultural production will be disrupted and over time will have to change. We will import impacts to the UK through the price and safety of food and other commodities, changes to the patterns of trade, disrupted supply chains and risks to overseas investments. An increased frequency of weather extremes will disproportionately affect low-income populations, as Lord Rooker has reminded us, and countries like the UK will be called upon increasingly to provide more humanitarian assistance. Efforts to build state stability and long-term resilience could be undermined. Further research is urgently needed to understand whether our current approaches to aid and development are contributing effectively to the long-term resilience and stability that is needed. We need to be aware of the danger that the need for humanitarian assistance in response to an increasing number of extreme weather events could shift international aid away from long-term development. Climate refugees and climate-driven migration are likely to become increasingly problematic, with potential impacts on extremist politics in developed nations. Overall, the research evidence indicated that the key international risks to the UK all fell into the more urgent categories, with more action needed on weather-related shocks to global food production and trade, risks from climate-related human displacement, so refugees, and more research needed on imported food safety risks, long-term changes in global food production, risks to the UK from international violent conflict, and risks to international law and governance. None of these have any formal actions in the NAP. Whilst the three relating to food production are mentioned in passing, the three related to migration, conflict and breakdown of international law and government are not mentioned anywhere at all in the 2018 NAP. The first National Adaptation Programme in 2013 set out the laudable aim of a society which makes timely, far-sighted and well-informed decisions to address the risks and opportunities posed by a changing climate. The second NAP endorses this aim. So why does it appear to ignore the international risks? Especially as the UK, and indeed our Prime Minister, is the global lead on resilience for the UN Secretary-General's Special Summit on climate change this September. The international risks are particularly difficult and sensitive: food security, refugees, migration, violent conflict, breakdown of international law. But there are issues that we as a society need to be discussing so that we can make well-informed decisions about how we want to address them. Some of these risks fall well outside DEFRA's departmental remit, but so do many of the climate risks to business, to communities and to infrastructure. Like climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation needs to be a cross-government priority. My questions for the Noble Lord the Minister are: 1, how do we ensure adaptation is a priority right across government? And 2, why does our National Adaptation Plan appear to overlook the significant and serious international climate change risks to the UK, despite the positive lead we are taking on resilience to climate change?
I congratulate the Noble Lord Rooker on securing this important debate and for his excellent and passionate remarks of introduction. And let me first say that we do have much to be proud of. We are showing global leadership in combating climate change. For example, a recent PwC study reports that the UK is reducing emissions faster than any other G20 country while still growing our economy. And 2018 was the cleanest and greenest year ever for electricity generation, as renewables generated more than 37% of UK electricity, up from 6% in 2010. Greenhouse gas emissions have reduced by a quarter since 2010. And the government deserves praise for its actions to decarbonise the power sector, with emissions down by 64% on 1990 levels. These are excellent achievements, but there is absolutely no room for complacency. There is so much more to be done, my lords, and as my noble friend Lord Deben outlined so eloquently, and as the report from the Climate Change Committee today also explains. If I may, my lords, I will focus most of the rest of my remarks on the big challenge, which is now transport, where emissions have actually been rising, partly as we are driving more, but also because car makers have not reduced emissions as quickly as they promised. Transport is now the sector with the highest level of emissions. And I hope that my noble friend, the Minister, agrees with me that this must change, and that there is a huge opportunity here for the UK to lead the world in the transition to electric vehicles. I declare an interest as a driver, a very happy driver, of an all-electric car. And I urge the government to do more to promote this form of road transport and to get our market moving as we are falling behind Europe's leaders. Providing £1.5 billion for supporting low-emission vehicles through its Road to Zero strategy is a start. We are also investing £3.5 billion to reduce emissions from road transport. But we need zero emissions, not just low emissions. So far this year, my lords, fully electric vehicles have been under 1% of new car sales. In Germany, the figure is 1.7%, the Netherlands is at 5%, and Norway, incredibly, is at 50%. This shows what can be done. And there are significant benefits to the planet and also to air quality for our citizens if we do so. The UK does have more than 17,000 public charging points for electric vehicles, of which around 1,700 are rapid devices. This is an achievement, of course, but far, far more is needed. Without a better regionally spread network of charging points, we will not reach the leadership position and targets that we could achieve. We need investments in infrastructure, and I would hope that the government could encourage more of our long-term investment funds, including, for example, local authority-funded pension schemes and other investors, to look for stable, long-term returns which can come from investing even more in climate change mitigation measures and improvements in our infrastructure. The funds in these long-term pension funds have huge resources available, and of course I would like to refer my noble friends, the Minister and noble lords, to my register of interests in this area. But I believe they could be far better utilised in securing often inflation-linked returns that can help meet their liabilities by investing not just in the income-producing elements, but also in the early-stage infrastructure, which can deliver better ways of managing the risks and returns of these funds than chasing, for example, government bonds. Early-stage infrastructure and environmentally friendly investments can deliver equity-like returns to investors who are willing to seek alternative sources of risk premium other than pure equity or hedge funds, and alternative sources of stable returns, often inflation-linked, outside the gilt market and outside the conventional, supposedly low-risk bond markets. These have potentially been heavily distorted by central bank policies, and we don't really understand yet what that has done to investment risk for long-term investors. Climate and environmentally friendly investments should, in my view, be a core part of any risk-return management assessment for long-term investors. In reducing transport sector emissions, may I suggest to my noble friend, the Minister, that the vehicle fleet for company cars is an extremely effective mechanism, and the company car market is often overlooked. We could encourage more zero-emission company cars. The government certainly deserves praise for showing leadership last year in committing to end petrol and diesel sales by 2040, but I believe it would be vital for the government to urgently confirm that future rates of company car tax beyond April 2021 can bring in the 2% rate for zero-emission vehicles for multiple years beyond that. And I would be grateful if my noble friend the Minister could take that back to his department. I fully agree with my noble friend Lord Deben that this should not be a party political issue. Encouraging institutional investors to take on more responsibility for investing in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and helping to mitigate the impact of climate change, which is already underway, for global security and economic stability, is a national issue, not a political one. And I shan't dwell on my concerns about the reduction in government resources which would result potentially from the problems we have on Brexit. And notwithstanding any of this, by utilising long-term investment resources, we could play a leading role in this area of critical importance to the planet, and indeed we must.
I too am grateful to my honourable friend Lord Rooker for introducing this debate at a time when we are coming to understand that the timetable for dealing with carbon emissions is much shorter than our generation had hoped. The science underpinning our understanding of carbon emissions and the consequences for the planet is not in doubt. Like my honourable friend Lord Rooker, I had, in preparation for the debate, read Mrs Thatcher's speech to the 1989 United Nations Conference, when she spoke of she is one of course, the very few of our Prime Ministers with a scientific background. She spoke of the vast amount of carbon dioxide reaching the atmosphere and the destruction at the same time on a vast scale of tropical forest, which are uniquely able to remove carbon dioxide from the air. It caused surprise at the time, but everything that she was concerned about in that speech has been borne out by accurate measurement and indeed the evidence of our own eyes. It is also now clear that we are not moving fast enough to check the growth of carbon gas emissions, and that our faith in our ability to find solutions quickly is misplaced. It was nearly 20 years after that speech that a Labour government was able to bring forward the Climate Change Act 2008, which provided a target of reducing emissions by at least 80% below the 1990 figures by 2020. That target now looks much too leisurely, and the IPCC report of 2018, commissioned by the 195 signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement, tells us that we simply do not have until 2030. Despite much good work by the Committee on Climate Change and much effort in reducing emissions from transport and power generation, not enough has happened. There have been welcome efforts to reduce demand for water and heating, but the hoped-for technological solutions to avert or swiftly to mitigate the increase in emissions have not been successful. Nuclear power generation has brought with it unsolved problems of disposal of nuclear waste. Wind and hydro generation are making a useful contribution, but neither can be very rapidly accelerated, and wave power is not proven. Neither have technological efforts to mitigate emissions been successful. There is, at the moment, no effective method of carbon emission storage. The proposed investment of £1 billion in 2015 to finding a solution was cancelled a year after it was proposed. One approach has, however, been a success, which ironically does not depend on technological innovation. Nearly 30 years ago, the Prime Minister spoke of using tropical forests as carbon sinks to mitigate the growth of emissions. In the intervening years, we have realised that we can enlist nature, both as a global community, but also significantly within our own borders. Here I speak with the benefit of being briefed by my daughter, who works for the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. At CCI, a collaboration of conservation academics and biodiversity organisations' combined expertise continues to prove that the restoration and recovery of nature, yes, forests, but also peatlands, wetlands, coastal systems and uplands, are highly effective carbon sinks, as well as contributing to the amenities for us all. Among the most measurable projects recently undertaken is the Great Fen, a large area of the fens in Cambridgeshire, which used to be increasingly exhausted, low-productivity farming land, has now been rewatered, a process which actually just involved turning off the pumps which have kept that land as farming land since the Dutch engineers installed them in the 17th and 18th century. And added to that a lot of careful water engineering to create the Great Fen. This is both now a lovely park, which provides a wild place to visit for the growing populations of Peterborough and Cambridge, but critically is a substantial carbon sink. My own friend Baroness Young, alas, is not here today, but it was she who chaired the organisation which brought this about, and I wish she were here. There are several working projects now managed by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, including Summit to Sea in mid-Wales and the Cairngorms Connect project in Scotland. The primary focus of these projects is the restoration and recovery of critical ecosystems, but we can expect carbon sequestration, hydrological changes, including flood management, air quality changes, and collateral community renewal as added value. Nature-based solutions, in short, are the low-hanging fruit in efforts to counter damaging carbon emissions and mitigate the effects that we are already experiencing from climate change. A report published in 2018 by the National Academy of Sciences concluded that it's possible, using natural solutions, to contribute 30% of the reductions in emissions necessary to keep the increase in global warming below 2% by 2030. It would not be difficult to expand this work. It can be quite featly done. It is a matter of largely water engineering. But the Great Fen was partly funded by philanthropy, and Summit at Sea and the Cairngorms projects are largely funded by private individuals and the Arcadia Trust set up by Elizabeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin. But to enable more developments of this sort to contribute to alleviating emissions cannot be achieved even by the most generous private philanthropy. Government money and the will to push through development will be needed to use to the full our natural assets of wetland and land exhausted by intensive farming and deforestation. This is an area which cannot really be left to the market. Money spent on measurement and cost-benefit analysis in this area would also be well spent. There is good work happening in several different places on researching the precise costs and measuring the benefits of this sort of expansion. Centralising this research could enable government to be presented with a wide choice of projects with the costs and the benefits set out so that decisions could be made quickly and action taken quickly on which proposals to support. I hope that in winding up the debate, ministers will feel able to agree on the importance of developing projects which use nature and our own land and can be developed quickly.
My Lords, we started off so well, but some speeches have tipped well over 6 minutes to make timing tight now for this debate. So when the clock reaches 6 minutes, I would ask peers to conclude their remarks.
My Lords, in February 2004, I introduced a debate on climate change in your Lordship's House. and it was prompted by the stark warning of the then government's chief scientific advisor, Sir David King, who said, "Climate change is the most severe problem we're facing today, more serious even than the threat of terrorism." The Blair government did actually take Sir David King's advice very seriously, and the government worked up a consensus on the way forward, a point so powerfully made by the Lord Rooker in his excellent introduction. That government established a joint committee of both houses to work on a draft bill, of which I was fortunate to be a member, which took evidence and advice. And it proved a really worthwhile way forward, and the resulting Climate Change Act was a world first. So I believe everything Lord Rooker said needs to be a lesson that is learnt today. Lord Deben was a little upset by my noble friend Baroness Featherstone's remarks that criticised this government for actually squandering 4 years and the progress that was made up till 2015. But I think that consensus doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to criticise lack of action where it happens, and that's important too. So I hope we will build a consensus today, but we must expect to have critical friends or even critical opposition at the same time to move us forward. I want to spend most of my speech on an issue that has been mentioned by the noble Lord Rooker, Deben and Whitty and Baroness McIntosh and possibly others, and that's the matter of soil. Soil has such a critical role to play in both mitigating and adapting to climate change. So, of course, it's a very good thing that DEFRA are working on a new strategy. But I must say to the Minister that the call for research doesn't even explicitly mention carbon storage or climate change. Perhaps it's implicit. But much worse was an issue that I discovered from my recent written question, that there is an absolute chronic shortage of soil scientists. This question was answered on the 5th of April, and the answer was that there are 5 professors of soil science in the UK, in England and Wales, and 25 academic staff in total. Now, that's certainly not enough to action DEFRA's requirements of an innovative approach to monitoring soil health in England and Wales. And I'd ask the Minister what urgent action the government's going to take to resolve that issue if we're going to actually develop appropriate soil metrics and a new environmental land management scheme, which the government has set out in its Future Farming Command Paper and the 25-year Environment Plan. We must resolve this issue of a lack of soil scientists. There is a very interesting international soil initiative, and here I'll declare an interest as a part owner of a vineyard in France. And that's that after the Paris Climate Change Accords of 2015, there's an initiative launched by the French called 4 per 1,000. And basically, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere increases by 4.3 billion tonnes a year. And the world's soils contain some 1,500 billion tonnes of carbon as organic matter. So if you increase the amount of that organic matter by just 0.4% a year, primarily by improving and restoring degraded agricultural land, then it would go a really long way to halting the annual increase of carbon in the atmosphere. And of course, at the same time, it would answer a lot of other things like soil fertility, which would be helping food production, water and biodiversity. So, my Lords, I think that those are all really worthwhile efforts. And just changing attitudes to soil, of course, involves farming in a very different way. No-till farming is now really gaining hold, but also more mixed farming, less monocultures. Perhaps something that the plan will look forward to is taxing the bad. That will be nitrogen-based fertiliser. And of course, we've already had a lot of discussion about rewarding the good, help for farmers who increase natural capital and who farm in an ecological way. And perhaps there I should also declare my co-chairmanship of the all-party group on agroecology. But equally important, I think, is clear labelling for consumers, because they need to know that they are actually buying something that is the best. Which brings me to my last point. In the last century, we had labelling of what miles per gallon a car would do. In this century, we actually need much clearer labelling about carbon footprints, and perhaps we even need to move to a system of personal carbon allowances, so that by having the labelling, we would know just how much of our personal carbon allowance we were using up. I hope that some think tank will return to this issue of personal carbon allowances, because even compared to 2012, and I think the last substantial amount of work was done on this issue, there are all sorts of mechanisms now, like phone apps, that would make it so much easier for a person to know exactly how much they were consuming. And of course, for those who want to combine climate change, as I do, with social justice issues, well, of course, those with the biggest incomes are often the biggest emitters of carbon through flying more, having 2 cars, bigger houses, etc. And the UK is in a great position technologically to maintain our lifestyle, but reduce our emissions.
My Lords, it's with huge pleasure that I congratulate Lord Rooker and Lord Rooker on bringing the debate today, and Lord Deben for his report, because it is brilliant timing on both their parts. And it's been a very happy time for me to listen to the debate. Some of the speeches have been incredibly passionate, and it saved my having to say some of these things. In fact, I've got quite a few scribbles through my speech, because others have said what I wanted to say much more passionately. It is also notable that today we've had the news that the Indonesian government has decided that they have to move their capital, Jakarta, because it is sinking so fast. It's sinking, some parts of it are sinking at a rate of 10 inches a year. And this is the first capital city, of course, to move for climate change reasons. And it is perhaps an indicator of the way that things are going. Now, for me, the Extinction Rebellion campaign has been a breath of fresh air. It's drawn the climate and ecological emergency to the forefront of political debate. It's moved the debate from whether all this is happening to when we can actually start to deal with it. By when can we preserve humanity, preserve some of our valuable ways of life. And the fact that they've been able to cut through all the Brexit noise and force politicians like us to confront the issues is proof that their tactics are legitimate and highly effective. They join the ranks of peaceful earth protectors across the world who risk so much in the pursuit of a safe climate and a secure future. And Extinction Rebellion has 3 simple core demands. One is to tell the truth, so that Parliament, having declared a climate and ecological emergency, must now work with others, with other institutions, with other groups, to communicate the need for change. The second thing is to act now. The government itself must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. The Climate Change Committee's report has made some valuable headway, but it was actually written before Extinction Rebellion's campaign had really got underway. And the fact is that now 60% of people agree with the Extinction Rebellion's aims, and that means that the political climate outside these houses has actually moved on, and that we can be more ambitious. I'm afraid the aim of 2050 is not only unambitious, it's shockingly weak and will not take us to the place of safety that we all need. It is a game changer, and I think it's wonderful it's happened, but it is not enough. And the third demand by Extinction Rebellion is to go beyond politics. So the government must create and be led by the decisions of citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological issues. Now, to go into those issues a little bit more deeply, telling the truth means admitting that the government's existing climate legislation is too weak and too slow. It requires the government to admit that they are planning to miss their legally binding climate budgets and are trying to find ways to water them down already. It means writing the Paris Agreement into UK law and sticking to the targets. It means having an honest conversation with the electorate about what this means and the scale of change that is needed to set us on the right course. Telling the truth also means using the statistics and data in an honest way. It means no longer saying that we've outperformed by reducing greenhouse gas emissions while growing the economy, when we know this has only happened because partly we're importing more from other countries and pretending that their emissions don't count. We can't fiddle the figures anymore. The government cannot cheat anymore on this. Luckily, the Climate Change Committee has advised on including shipping and aviation emissions into government figures, which hopefully will remove, for example, the option of Heathrow expansion. But we should also include our imports. People are always, there's a lot of whataboutery about China and other countries who perhaps aren't doing their bit. Well, we have to accept that we're actually encouraging their emissions by our imports, and we should take responsibility for those import emissions, and at the moment we don't. And telling the truth means being honest with each other and with ourselves that this is a terrifying state of affairs. Anyone who isn't afraid of the future of our planet is either uninformed or living in willful ignorance. And acting now means taking at least the same amount of political will, civil service resource and legislative time that's been spent on Brexit and applying that to the climate and ecological emergency. It means a 2-year parliamentary session with a Queen's speech focused entirely on climate and ecology, cancelled recesses and these endless statutory instruments. It means strong and far-ranging manifesto commitments from all the political parties, which are then implemented obsessively for years to come. We're acting for the future of our planet, for the future of humanity, for the future of our children and our grandchildren. We're acting for the needs of nearly 8 billion humans on Earth, along with millions of other species with whom we share our home. And acting now also means serious enforcement, serious legislation. It means massive state intervention in huge market failures, radical taxation and subsidies, nationalisation of certain industries, and the creation of 1 million climate jobs. It means zero carbon homes, enormous green infrastructure projects, and forging happier, healthier lives with a much smaller footprint on the earth. It also means banning fracking, writing off huge fossil fuel reserves. I do advise any peers who've got fossil fuel investments to get rid of them now. And it's 6 minutes. I'm going to end. I would say that Greta Thunberg made the point that we should be panicking, and personally I've been panicking for years. A friend of mine once said that my worst character flaw was saying I told you so, and I want to say to the House today, I told you so. And we've got to get on and actually make a difference.
My Lords, first my congratulations to Lord Rooker for this important debate about critical decisions being taken by societies and governments about the key issues of human-induced climate change and the important decisions that they need to make about the future. Yesterday's report in the UK certainly was a significant contribution. I declare my interest as a former head of the Met Office, which has in fact played a world-leading organisation for climate change research. I'm also involved in universities, and the UK universities play a very world-leading role as well to deal with climate science. Decisions are greatly benefiting from the excellent BBC television and other media explanations of science and the many practical measures being taken. Even school children have been following this, as other noble lords have referred to their grandchildren. I refer to my scientific granddaughter, who has also greatly enjoyed them. These programmes, and not only these programmes, but also public demonstrations and indeed public notices on French motorways, are explaining the need to reduce the artificial emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. We have to avoid the steady rise of concentrations of these gases, to avoid the gradual rise of temperature in the atmosphere and ocean surface. Public debate, as Baroness Brown emphasised, and decisions are now also focusing on the damage to societies caused by and infrastructure, such as floods, fires, high winds, and rising sea level. The classic case of this is the islands in the Pacific, which are likely to have to evacuate their whole small country, as a result of sea level rise. Environmental dangers to agriculture and industry will also have high costs, as other noble lords have emphasised. Evidence about human-induced climate change is particularly visible in the polar regions, not only in the melting of sea ice and glaciers, but also the significant effects on weather patterns at lower latitudes, as we've seen with the varied jet stream and polar vortices, now regularly referred to on the media in terms of the jet stream and subpolar. It's quite something when you have to use new technology or new expressions to explain the changes taking place. But these models are also extremely important in reassuring, you might surprise today, it's reassuring about the future. Because as we learned at the Royal Society meeting in 2015, these models show how, if the rise of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases was to cease, as many noble peers are talking about, then the models show that this would actually lead to the climate patterns returning. And so, in other words, we are in a situation still, and perhaps probably for much of this century, in which, if the policies are correct, we will see a return to the nature that we are wanting. We need also to continue science to debate with climate skeptics. Still a problem, as some leading newspapers, as I saw to my surprise in the centre page of the Times yesterday. Critical policies for reducing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere depend on reducing emissions resulting from human activities, as has been commented, industry, transport, and also finding direct innovative responses, which is what we need in industry, transport, deforestation, and controlling the vast emissions from natural sources of hydrocarbons, such as the high melting of permafrost and fracking in northern United States. Soil and water policies are also critical. And yet the World Meteorological Organization, of which I used to represent the UK, and the UK is very involved, has regrettably begun to consider the possibility of downgrading the historical importance of international water programs. And this is an important matter for the Foreign Office, and I hope that will be taken on board. Technological developments must minimise the dangers to society and enable new low-carbon designs for societies, especially in endangered and high populations in urban areas where temperatures are threatening human health, but also minimising, for example, using new technology for minimising the high temperatures in tropical urban areas through solar collectors, as in the large cities now in China. Urban dangers also are important in coastal areas subject to extreme flooding, and also, as we also consider, the exposed mountainous areas in Nepal. There are other examples where energy technology policies need to be combined between different types of electricity generation. This is why in the UK, wind and solar energy systems have to be combined with other energy systems, particularly nuclear, that can operate in weather conditions when the renewables cannot operate. In Asia, the generally low winds and cloudy conditions are driving the need for nuclear energy in, for example, Laos, Vietnam, and Singapore, and so on. These countries are currently planning a future energy based upon nuclear fission. But at the same time, there's growing investment, public and private, in Europe and the United States, that nuclear fusion will be providing clean energy, perhaps even within the next 10 to 20 years. I declare an interest as a consultant to Tokamak Energy. Thanks to recent technological breakthroughs in superconducting magnetic fields, for which the UK is a pioneer, and plasma physics, we may see this great advantage of fusion is that it will not produce radioactive waste, which has been mentioned by other noble lords. Indeed, the technology will eventually safely reprocess the wastes, and that is one of the reasons why I'm very interested in this advanced technology. I'm confident that, as in the previous developments of science and technology, the way they have benefited society, it's very important to consider the benefits and explanations to society. And this is an important role of world leaders, as we talked about Mrs. Thatcher long ago. So let's hope that when Mr. Trump comes here in May, we give him an earful of what we have been hearing this afternoon.
My Lords, yes, global warming needs urgent action, but it must be conducted simultaneously, both horizontally, cross-party and internationally, as we've heard, but also we must all act at several vertical levels to form a unity of purpose. Extinction Rebellion are waking up people at all 4 levels. At level 1, individuals now see themselves needing to change their behaviour. At level 2, small enterprises, NGOs and charities are innovating and cooperating. At 3, huge corporations now see that they must change direction. And 4, we in government must respond with urgency today at national and international level. I'll speak on the actions on these 4 levels, because unless we act at all levels in harmony, we will fail and become extinct as a species. So 1, at the level of the individual, noble lords will know that I'm a practitioner and advocate of mindfulness and yoga. I practice these and want others to join, not for just health, but to change the way I think and act. When one is in the normal, everyday lower level of consciousness at one's amygdala, where we have a fight and flight response, one thinks only of me and my family and now and next week. When one's able to experience mindfully a higher consciousness, one starts to think of the wider good of all beings at the longer perspective of all time. People are waking up to this realization that we need to think and act in this long-term, selfless, compassionate way. I met yesterday with the ADOT Foundation, who say that giving is receiving. Their mission is to spread the use of their website, adot.com, that shows that experiencing something greater than one's habitual self is life-enhancing and can save the planet. 2, at the next level, where small projects need support to grow and work together, let me just cite one example. The IPCC say that the barriers to reforestation are lack of political will, finance and stability. They know that massive tree planting can help save the planet. A registered UK charity, Tree Sisters, are already planting 200,000 trees a month. They're calling for this reforestation to be embedded in every individual financial transaction. Last year, consumers in the UK made 26 billion transactions. If each transaction, say over £25, had contained an embedded forest restoration charge of, say, 50p, we'd be well on our way to planting the trillion trees for which the planet has space. An independent ethical lifestyle media company, My Green Pod, is already doing this, adding 50p to every financial transaction on its online marketplace. They sell only products that are good for people and the planet. We as government should set out a way of helping all businesses to collect and donate to this surcharge in the UK, thereby being a light to all nations. 3, at the next level, many huge corporations are aware of the issue and have been trying to help for years. I, as a retailer, worked for an enlightened company that was conscious of the use of resources and the need to save waste. For those reasons, we used no fancy packaging, no costly window displays, no advertising, used energy-saving lighting, and we established the Volcani Institute of Agriculture in Israel that invented drip irrigation, the Weizmann Institute of Science that pioneered solar energy, the Shenkar College of Textile Technology and Design that created clothing that lasted for years rather than months. But now, my lords, this is an emergency. Most businesses today are not designed in the context of a developing climate emergency. Hence, we must urgently redesign entire industries and businesses. Last week, there was an urgent letter written to the Times, signed by prominent people from huge organisations, written including friends and colleagues whom I know are serious in this point. Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever, Sir Tim Smith from the Eden Project, Jake Hayman from 10 Years' Time and son of our former Lord Speaker, Bevis Watts, Triologus Bike and Gail Bradbrook, Extinction and Rebellion. They suggested that business should make a declaration that we face a climate change emergency and organise a session at full board meeting to consider the case for urgent action, and they're going to encourage the senior management team of which they're part to do likewise. And 4, and finally, my lords, to tie all this together, we, government, must act. There are organisations waiting for new bills coming from government, and they will go into businesses and help them change. The Global Consciousness Movement, GCM, is such a grassroots global consultancy established to utilise the talent, energy and creativity of young professionals to teach big companies the principles and practices of sustained business. My Lords, I'm grateful for my noble friend Lord Rooker for this debate. I hope that this House can persuade Her Majesty's Government to see the urgency and act forcefully and speedily to address these crises, so that my grandchildren, Ziva, Asher, Elian, and one yet to be named, like Lord Deben's grandchildren, will be reading Hansard in 30 years' time and thanking us for having saved the planet. Thank you.
Noble Lord Rooker certainly knows how to get things done. No sooner did this subject for debate appear on the order paper than the streets of London were clogged with Extinction Rebellion demonstrators. Yesterday, the Commons voted to, I think, to declare a climate emergency, and today we have 660 pages, is it, Lord Deben, from the Committee on Climate Change. I think that's a tremendous thing. I also think it's a tremendous thing how the Extinction Rebellion demonstration was received. I've got some critical things to say about them later, but I thought the tabloid newspapers would have 3 billion tonnes of CO2 released by cars jammed in by Extinction Rebellion. Or, ooh, look how this demonstrator travelled to London in a gas guzzler. I thought the establishment would turn on them. And in fact, they haven't. They've been received, and their leader has been received with great seriousness and respect. And I do applaud that. But I don't entirely agree with the protesters for two reasons. One is, and I think this has even been a feature of your Lordship's debate too, I do think we tend to forget how much progress has been made in how many areas in this field, not just in public consciousness, but in actual change. 47% of our electricity came from low-carbon sources in 2016, doubled since 2010. You know, you can have Parliament sitting through every recess in history, but you're not going to get faster action than that. And I'm afraid that campaigners tend to ignore those kind of facts because they instead turn instinctively to the contemporary language and wisdom that governments and politicians are fools and liars. Politicians have many faults. We have many faults ourselves, but we are not on the whole fools or liars. Secondly, while applauding their motives, I do think that some of the policies which they seem to advocate are actually counterproductive to dealing with climate change. GM technology, we've got to feed the world in more difficult circumstances in the future, and yet there's been a knee-jerk reaction against GM technology. Nuclear power, I know that the Greens are divided about nuclear power, but far too many people instinctively oppose nuclear power, which is the cleanest source of all, and as we've heard this afternoon, new forms of nuclear power may emerge which combine safety with a big contribution to reducing things. And the final point I want to make is about fracking, slightly greater length, dedicated to Natasha Engel, who resigned as fracking Tsar this week because the industry is being health and safety out of existence. Now, I know some noble lords have spoken on this. My knowledge is confined to that which I gained when I was on the Economic Affairs Committee, which completed, on your Lordship's behalf, a very serious inquiry into fracking. And the bottom line conclusion is very simple. It halves the amount of emissions that would otherwise take place from fossil fuels, and there are no really serious risks involved. And, you know, I think of the witness who appeared before the committee who complained that fracking meant using lots of chemicals. Well, that was quite true because you use a lot of H2O in fracking. And so I asked him what chemicals he had in mind that he didn't think were very good. And his answer was that he was a hairdresser and couldn't be expected to answer questions like that. This was the leader of the fracking lobby in one area. I mean, it's great that he got involved, but really we do have to be careful that reason doesn't get lost in all this. I think another danger of that, I'm not sure with doing everything we can about reducing our emissions is going to solve the problem, particularly while we've got a climate denier in the White House. And there may have to be new high-tech solutions which cut through. I commend the work of a former economist colleague of mine, Oliver Morton, and his book, The Planet Remade, How Geoengineering Could Change the World. I won't go into the individual projects, iron fertilization, for example. But this is going to be a real challenge for those who believe, as I do, that we face a threat here. Are they going to take the attitude that these projects are welcome? If the scientists tell us that they will make a big contribution to reducing global warming, that they should be embraced? Or are we going to get a lot of glib rhetoric about how this is just a way to get round reducing emissions, lots of scaremongering about dreadful, though probably imaginary, side effects? In the end, my lords, protests will not solve this crisis. Technological advance, mature policy making, and brave politicians will be needed for that. I hope that the demonstrators in future will deploy not just their hearts, but their heads in support of the measures that really could avert this genuinely terrifying threat.
My Lords, I would like to begin by thanking Lord Rooker for securing this debate. When we talk about climate change, I think we need to remember who our opponents are. And unless we know our opponents, it becomes very difficult to make out a case. Now, when we talk about climate change, we are advancing three propositions. First, there is climate change. Second, it is created by or fueled by human activities. And thirdly, it has or will have certain consequences, such as drought, floods, agricultural crisis, and so on. Now, those who deny climate change deny either one or all three propositions. They deny that there is climate change, or they might say, yes, there is climate change, but it is not created by human activities. Or thirdly, they might say, yes, it is created by human activities, but the consequences attributed to it are highly exaggerated. We don't believe it. The important thing for us, therefore, is to show why these three propositions on which our case rests are absolutely valid. Now, I don't have the time to go through all that, but I think we can point to the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, NASA report which said that 97% of scientists agree that climate change is due to human activities. And it is also the case that in our country, in the House of Commons, when the Climate Change Act was going through, 463 MPs supported it, only 3 against it. So I think one can show, for all kinds of, invoking all kinds of considerations, that there is a scientific imperative to deal with problems that climate change poses. In addition, I think there is a second ground on which climate change can be pressed, and that's the democratic ground. Morally, of course, we ought to be concerned with the consequences of our actions and how it affects the future generations. In this case, it's not just future generations in the abstract. We are talking about future generations concretely present in the shape of children over 12, 13, 14, 15, asking for their rights. So what you have is a situation where if we ignore the future generations, we are ignoring the consequences of our actions for actual living people. And we invite intergenerational warfare, which is hardly the thing that we should be asking for. So having made out a case for climate change control and all that, I want to ask a different question and face the opponents on our side. If you talk about climate change, as I have done, then obviously we need to do a great deal at the individual and collective level. Look at the way, for example, in which the report this morning published by the Climate Change Committee wants us to do certain things or not to do certain things. It says, for example, the thermostat must be set at 19 degrees centigrade, that people should not be eating or should be cutting down on beef and lamb, or that they should take bus to work rather than car, or they should light bulbs of a certain kind. We are also told that, look, if you are in favor of climate change, you should not be traveling by air, or you should not be going for packages, because I am told that packages contribute between 20 and 30% to the greenhouse gas. Now, if you start thinking along these lines and fully implementing the policy on curtailing the impact of climate change, look at the consequences. Is it realistic to say to people, look, you will not travel by air, or you will not use bulbs of a certain kind? It is, but only up to a point. Secondly, how invasive it becomes into people's lives and people's liberties. And thirdly, of course, how paternalistic, illiberal it sounds for the government to produce a report asking people to behave in certain ways. In other words, controlling or countering the reality of climate change requires a profound change in our ways of thinking, in our ways of living. And unless we genuinely believe that we are prepared to make those changes, then I think we should be careful in what we advocate. There is also the other thing worth bearing in mind. When we talk about climate change, we can't localize it. It's a global phenomenon. And therefore, we need to be tackling this issue at the global level. But at the global level, there are the poor countries and there are rich countries. The share of burden that the poor countries have to carry, they can't carry that kind of burden. The rich countries, therefore, show more altruism. Are they prepared to do that? And unless, again, we are convinced that the rich countries are prepared to make that kind of sacrifice, it is difficult to talk about climate change. So my own view would be, we certainly should push for climate change, but bearing in mind that it will involve painful sacrifices on our part here in the West and making painful changes in our ways of thinking and our ways of living.
I thank the Noble Lord Rooker for securing this timely climate change debate today. It is an opportunity where we can all focus and support a strong, determined, non-political pathway for change, as public concern about climate has increased to levels we've never witnessed before, and those concerns have to be addressed. My Lords, climate change, as we know, has moved to the top of the political agenda, resulting in urgent need for instigating more decisive actions for future generations to come. In the other House yesterday, they acknowledged the climate change plan, which could make Britain the first major economy to reduce its carbon footprint to zero, which is a dramatic change from the current target of a reduction of 80% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. The UK has become the biggest user of offshore wind energy farms, and seeing how much they have grown in relative short number of years, where costs too have fallen significantly. And with further enhancement to develop the so-called carbon capture, utilisation and storage facilities. To continue reducing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and help drive net emissions to zero, the UK needs to build a number of CCUS carbon capture plants to hold those millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide, with possibly one of the main sites designated, and I agree early with Lord Prescott's comments that the Humber region is host to one of the biggest, UK biggest on and offshore wind farms in the UK. Looking at the face of it, we have a colossal amount to do. The people expect more in this agenda of addressing change. We need now to tackle the growing environmental crisis, because the longer we delay, the harder it's going to be. Last year, 6.8 tonnes of greenhouse gases were emitted into the atmosphere per head of the UK population. So we must look at the mechanism, how we continue to bring that down to zero. So everything must be included in the mix for those future massive changes in transport, retrofitting of housing, replacing boilers with heat pumps, and major changes in food production, to name a few. As climate change takes hold, we're now seeing increasing storms, rising sea levels, disappearing coral reefs, catastrophic flooding, as well as ice caps melting, as current temperatures are on course to rise by 3 degrees centigrade, heading to devastating heat waves, raising the risk of large-scale, irreversible impacts. As we look back to 5 years ago, where nearly 63% of the UK electricity generated by coal, oil, compared to 15% of renewables, we now look to last year, the equation changed from 63% fossil fuels to nearly 44%, and 15% to nearly 32% for renewables is a good marker, and 2018 was the greenest and cleanest. I mentioned earlier regarding food production, where management practice has to improve in agriculture, helping to reduce carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, as all this will have an impact on the future diet requirements and the cost associated too, as well as seeing a greater loss in crop yields, loss of wildlife and wetlands. Our countryside has certainly a large part to play in the climate change, and we must use it to the best advantage. For example, in freeing land to plant trees, looking possibly at forest cover to increase from 13 to 17%, miles of hedgerows that have been pulled out, and so we need to see those reinstated, shrubs, all that can absorb carbon dioxide as well as enhancing the environment. Nature is waiting. I would like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister what is the latest number of tree planting schemes started and completed or in the pipeline. I'm pleased too the UK is leading by example in reducing annual emissions by more than 43% since 1990, but much more is needed. And of course, time is of the essence. As Lord Deben said earlier, we can't hang about too long. We have to get a move on to get that goal of zero emission target, enabling our future economy to be cleaner, smarter and more efficient for our future generation. But as we say, we're all in this together, as people, young and old, want to play some part in driving that challenge for change, as we've seen in recent days, a call for action. There is no doubt that climate change is the most profound environmental challenge facing the world today. My Lords, we have a target of net zero date for 2050, but we must have good, well-designed policies in reaching that goal, and climate change must be placed at the heart of our economic agenda.
My Lords, in preparing for today's debate, I looked at a text of a lecture on the subject of the atmosphere and the threat of global warming that I delivered exactly 25 years ago, and which remains on my academic website. It does not seem to be out of date, for the reason that by 1994, the science of global warming was well established. However, there were uncertainties about the speed of the onset of the process of global warming and its liability to be accelerated through feedback effects. One of these feedback effects is due to the melting of polar ice. It was uncertain how rapidly the melting would proceed. Bare seawater is much more absorptive of radiation than our ice and snow, and their melting would serve to accelerate the process of global warming, but to an unknown extent. The melting of the permafrost released large quantities of methane gas, which has a far greater warming effect than carbon dioxide, and this will also serve to accelerate global warming. The processes of photosynthesis, which captures carbon dioxide, and those of biological decay, which emit it, are both enhanced by warming, but it was uncertain which of these would advance more rapidly. However, the destruction of forests has proceeded apace, which has reduced the rate of carbon sequestration. A further reason for the uncertainties was the difficulty in predicting the human response to the crisis of global warming in its various phases. I asserted that the crisis, which was presently threatened, would become imminent at some stage, and then, in a short time, it would become actual. The nature of the human response would depend, to some extent, on the duration of these phases. The feedback processes have proved to be stronger than was widely imagined. The human response has been much weaker, and the crisis has indeed become actual sooner than one might have imagined. At the time, there was some optimism that the effective actions would be taken to staunch the emissions of carbon dioxide, but these have grown steadily. In 1994, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 was less than 360 parts per million by volume. The emissions are, in fact, following an exponential trend, and today the concentration exceeds 400 parts per million by volume. ICE core data suggests that the pre-industrial concentration was perhaps 275 parts per million. The ultimate effect of the present levels is bound to be disastrous. The eventual levels may well be much higher. The main reason for the increased burden of atmospheric carbon dioxide has been the advance in manufacturing and the increasing adoption of Western lifestyles in the developing economies of Asia. American emissions have been largely unchecked, while in some European countries, such as the UK, they've declined slightly. We've passed rapidly from the era of recognition, when the warnings were being widely broadcast, and when timely action to divert climate catastrophe was first called for, to the present era, which could be described as the age of reckoning, when the catastrophe is upon us. We have squandered our early opportunities, and we must now act with extreme urgency. This country has achieved much less in reducing its carbon expenditure than many of us might imagine. It's true that in generating electricity we've largely replaced our coal-fired power stations by gas-fired plant and by wind farms. Also, our total consumption of electricity is slightly less than it was in the 1980s. These developments have been enabled within the UK by an ongoing process of deindustrialisation. However, if we reckon the carbon costs of what we consume, these have not been reduced. Much of what we consume is now manufactured in countries in which carbon emissions have grown rapidly, and others, including Lord Whitty, have made this point earlier. Moreover, the Climate Change Committee is telling us that we are liable to miss the targets for the reduction of our domestic carbon emissions that were cast into legislation. How should we react to these circumstances? I'll describe three plausible reactions. The first reaction is to adopt a counsel of despair. Our own carbon consumption must seem insignificant in relation to the global total. It can be asserted that our efforts at self-restraint in our emissions cannot have much of a global effect, and that they cannot be to our advantage. They will allow others to act with less restraint. I reject this outlook. A second and a more moral stance is to pursue the course of self-restraint with renewed vigour. It's been proposed that we should seek to exploit renewable sources of power, wind and sun, with increased determination, while enhancing the efficiency of our uses of energy. We should curtail our personal transport, and we should insulate our houses. These are nostrums of parsimony and abstemiousness that I do support. However, the difficulty with such a programme of austerity is that it would be unlikely to afford us sufficient margins of additional power with which to pursue the electrification of heating and transport, which will be the key to further reductions in our emissions. The third recommendation is that we should pursue with the utmost vigour a technological revolution in the generation and the use of electrical power in order to produce a plenitude that would allow us to supplant all other sources of power. To achieve this, we need to build more nuclear power stations. The surplus power from these stations, which will occur at times if they are at certain times if they're run at a constant level, should be used to generate hydrogen by electrolysis. The hydrogen will be a source of power in times of high demand for electricity. It should also be available for use in fuel cells that should power our public and our private transport. This technological revolution, which we must pursue will demand courage. And it's liable to create a thriving economy, which should be capable of exporting to the rest of the world its solutions for confronting the scourge of global warming.
To thank most warmly my noble friend Lord Rooker for his powerful introduction to this debate, and for all his consistent and ongoing work in this area. It's also important to take the opportunity of the debate to put on record the cross-floor appreciation of the unremitting and passionate commitment of Lord Deben in this sphere, and also for the similar total commitment and enthusiasm of my noble friend, Lord Prescott. My Lords, I think it's sometimes important in our debates to listen to other people and not just ourselves in this House. And the leadership which has been provided by Greta Thunberg, which has impressed us all, has of course been there in the leadership of so many members of civil society for a number of years. I would like directly to quote from Christian Aid. There's a global climate emergency, climate change which has been largely caused by developed countries is wreaking havoc in many developing countries. Many are forced to declare a state of emergency due to extreme weather and climate impacts, such as Mozambique in the aftermath of repeated cyclones. Climate change is now the biggest factor setting back efforts to end poverty in the wider world. Extreme weather and climate impacts hit every populated continent, killing, injuring and displacing many millions of people and causing major economic damage. 2018 was the fourth hottest year on record, with average global temperatures nearly 1 degree centigrade above the pre-industrial average. Current international pledges to cut emissions place us on track for around 3 degrees of centigrade of warming, which would have catastrophic effects. Climate injustice is rampant. Richer countries have continued to delay the necessary action and defended the incumbent industries and vested interests such as fossil fuel sector. Many demands by developing countries for more finance and technology have been largely ignored. Climate finance is not a matter of aid, but a matter of justice, to repay the debts owed from using up the global carbon budget in our industrial revolutions in the past. Averting further serious impacts of climate change requires an urgent, rapid and large-scale response by governments all around the world, action and investment which are tantamount to a state of emergency. A state of emergency is justified. The usual politics of incremental change is not enough to cut the emissions fast enough. There is massive public support in the North and Global South for rapid, large-scale action to protect the environment. Politicians must wake up. My Lords, they're right. And indeed, the Secretary-General of the UN himself was right when he spoke out so strongly in last year, reminding us of our responsibility for international action. If we hear nothing else from the Minister in his response today, I hope we will be able to have a reassuring and convincing case that the arrangements for an emergency are in fact being put in place across government, that all departments are being encouraged to see their role in the situation and to be playing a full and active part in bringing together the essential aggregated policy which will require the mobilisation of government as a whole. Others have spoken of their grandchildren. I would only say this, that I look at my grandsons and granddaughter, and I think of the generations beyond. I don't know how we can face them unless we turn this into action. And what my noble friend Lord Rooker said in opening the debate was so crucially important. This is not a time any longer for expressions of good intentions and of moral conviction. This is a time for action, and we need to see that that action is actually taking place. We've heard from Lord Rooker that the arrangements and the policies necessary to fulfil what should be done are there. It's a matter of putting them into action.
My Lords, I declare my interest as a trustee of the Green Purposes Company that holds a green share in the Green Investment Bank. Can I say it is a delight to be part of a debate that the noble Lord Rooker has introduced, given his key role in this House and in fact in Parliament when the Climate Change Act was finally approved in 2008, just over a decade ago. And it makes me wonder whether the cycles of enthusiasm and determination about climate change maybe goes on a 10-year cycle. I hope not. I hope it'll be a little bit more consistent over the next 10 years. I also want to particularly congratulate the noble Lord Deben on the work of the Climate Change Committee. I, with a number of other noble lords, were privileged to be at that presentation this morning and to be asked by the Chief Executive, Chris Stark, actually to read the whole document because it was comprehensive and was do as good, which is quite a big ask for us these days, but was good. Having said that, I mean, one of the things about this debate is there is passion, which there needs to be, and some attitude. And I was a little disappointed with the noble Lord Deben when he rather attacked my noble friend Baroness Featherstone. Believe me, you are both completely on the same side over this issue. And I'm sure that is true more generally over this subject as it was back in 2008. And it is important that we not only agree, but that we call government to account, because that is what Parliament and what this chamber is partly about. And I think it is impossible not to, as my noble friend did, to mention the car crash that there was at the time of regime change in 2015, when, frankly, onshore wind disappeared, carbon capture and storage ended, the zero-carbon homes, that vandalism of stopping zero-carbon homes happened. And not only that, we actually abolished the Department of Energy and Climate Change as well, which was sort of actually illustrated all too well where that was. Now, the person that instigated that is no longer in the government. In fact, he's no longer in Parliament. He edits the local rag in the evening paper in London, and he's doing a great job there. But what that says to me is if there's one thing the government needs to do over climate change, whatever the government is now or in the future, it is you have to get the Treasury on board. You have to make sure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the standard bearer of climate change and this particular crisis even more than anybody else. And I have to say that I do believe that we have rested on our laurels for the last 4 years because of those changes. And I don't for a minute question the authentic wish and determination of the noble Lord Henley, the Minister, of Claire Perry, of Greg wrong Greg, but to actually implement this policy, but more needs to happen. And the outcome of resting on our laurels has been that the Climate Change Committee says that we will not meet our 4th and 5th carbon budgets. That's even as they are at the moment, aiming for 80% in 2050. And that 4th carbon budget starts
in 2023. That's only 4 years ahead. We have no time. And the one question, probably the only question I would ask of the Minister is, I can't ask him, will the government commit itself to meet the report that came out this morning, because that's not reasonable, because the government will consider it. But how will the government actually meet its present commitments to the 4th and 5th carbon budget? What actions will they take actually to do that? Because at the moment, what we have had is very worthy, very good, lots of paper on the whole. We've had a number of strategies. We have the waste and resources strategy, we've had the clean growth strategy, we've had the 25-year environmental plan, and we've had the road to zero strategy. And yet, what is the outcome of those? Well, let's go through some of the major emission sectors. In terms of power generation, then yes, the country, all of us, have done very well indeed in the past administrations. We have a hole in terms now of the nuclear, the Toshiba and the Hitachi stations don't look like they're going ahead. We have a hole there, but the one thing I give absolute credit to the government on is in terms of carrying on the contracts for difference, in terms of offshore wind, and we have, I think, another 900 turbines out there still to be delivered under the present plans. Excellent, but that is not going to do everything we can, so we need to improve on that. In terms of heat, big area. Noble Viscount Humber mentioned that particularly. We have got nowhere on that. We're still discussing it. We have got nowhere. I was delighted that Noble Baroness Lady Altman brought up the transport side, and indeed we have rising emissions with the white vans of mail order delivery. That's going up there. And I look to see not the sales, but what is the stock of electric vehicles? What percentage of electric vehicles do we have as our total stock at the moment? It is 0.2%. 1/5 of 1% of vehicles on our roads are electric at this present moment. We have a huge distance still to go on that. And as Sir John Armitt of the National Infrastructure Commission reminded us only, I think, last week, and again, exactly as the Noble Baroness has said, we absolutely have to have an infrastructure of charging points that works, that gives people the courage to buy their vehicles, that they can actually drive them and continue to drive them, and yet we do not have that at the moment. And then in terms of agriculture and land use, again, NFU has now committed to zero carbon in 2040, although that's quite sketchy. But again, we have no real action there yet. In the area of peatlands that concerns me, one of the biggest carbon sinks that we have, then we still have a voluntary code, and the use in horticulture and in compost is actually going up. It's not coming down. We need mandatory controls there. And in terms of carbon capture and storage, Claire Perry, I'm delighted to say, has said that we should have schemes operating by 2030, but we've already been told by other experts this will just not happen commercially as it is at the moment. So we have a huge distance to go on these areas. And again, Chris Stark told us, the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee this morning, in the past, the plan was to do these serially, one after another, through the major sectors. We now have to do them all at the same time. And that is going to be a challenge, but it is doable under the technology that we have. And I, again, want to congratulate the Climate Change Committee on not factoring in future technologies. The report is on its existing technologies, and I hope, taking the Noble Baroness Jones's point about bringing that date forward, I think when that technology changes, then that is the time to bring that date forward. But it certainly needs to come forward. My Lords, I've perhaps sounded a little pessimistic. I want to, again, as I did do in Lady Jones's debate in the Moses Room, only a month ago, that was rather less attended at the time, I would say, and go through some of the huge benefits that we have as well from actually meeting these targets. One of them is clean air, which I think is going to be a rising political issue, already is. Better health. We're going to have higher and better skilled employment, and I believe strong and robust economic growth in this sector. We'll also have a circular economy, so it's not just around carbon emissions, we actually use the resources of our planet again, circulate them, and actually make that sustainable. And what we do by following this trajectory, new trajectory of zero carbon by 2050, is that we take back that leadership on climate change as a nation that I believe that we have partly, and I only say partly, lost over the last 4 years. My Lords, this has been, I've really enjoyed this debate, and what I really like about it is the passion, yes, the attitude, but also the fact that we are agreed, and there are no climate change deniers, as the noble Lord Prescott, I think, mentioned here today, because we now know that this is the truth. What I say from Liberal Democrat benches is that we might want to call the government to account, but what we're desperate to do is to be a part of all other parties and those of none in this House to actually work to the solution and achieve zero carbon emissions in 2050.
I'm grateful to my noble friend Lord Rooker for introducing this very timely debate today, and I thank all noble lords for their contributions. I congratulate my noble friend for his introduction and for his choice of title, that the House takes note of the government's legal responsibilities. Against the background of recent events and demonstrations, it is time to show leadership and reset the parameters, taking legislative action in addition to resetting policy areas. And I declare my interest of having 5 grandchildren. Parliament is excellent at framing policies, debating issues and defining problems. However, there's a general lack of profile of this activity outside of Parliament, such that to the public it seems like a lack of activity, a lack of urgency and a lack of will. Certainly it is not helped by trivialisation in the media, whereby today's important report by the Committee on Climate Change is portrayed as merely calling for everyone to wear a sweater and turn down the heating. If only it was that simple. Dialogue with the public has certainly been helped by the Secretary of State for the Environment, Michael Gove, admitting that not enough has been done, in contrast to the self-congratulatory stance recently undertaken by other members of the government. By all means, we will give credit where it is due, as the noble Lord Lipsey admits, but let's get real. The climate emergency movement is to be congratulated on the way it has raised the profile of the issue of climate change and underlined its importance. Let us take up the challenge rather than argue over how to police such protests. First, we need to get our figures right. Rather than self-congratulatory responses, let us look at whether Greta Thunberg is correct and include all forms of emissions, including aviation and shipping. Let us look at the built environment. Let us look at democratising responses so that everyone not only realises they have responsibilities, but they must also take individual action themselves. All organisations must also undertake their own audit and put their own interpretations on how they must respond in their organisation's actions. Let us look at the pace of change. The IPCC has given governments their assessments of the science. The pace of change must quicken to bring about a new green industrial revolution. Then, in recognising and identifying what this information tells us, it is for governments to reset legal targets for eliminating all greenhouse gas emissions within a demanding time frame. Labour is taking the lead on this, and it is interesting that the Committee on Climate Change agrees in principle with the Labour target to achieve net zero emissions before 2050. This then requires milestones to be set ahead to build in a pathway to survival and the elimination of threats. In recognition of the right culture that must be embedded throughout government, local authorities, organisations and individuals, these targets must apply across the board. For example, energy efficiency measures must include all buildings and households to be upgraded to an EPC Band C standard by 2030 to undertake the demand-side response in addition to the decarbonisation of supply. The democratisation of response must be inclusive so that governments must not cut and curtail needed contributions from feed-in tariff schemes. Necessary infrastructure developments such as smart meters must be continued to be rolled out to success, and other technological advances. These targets will then set the parameters against which the Government and Parliament must develop sustainable, stable policies consistent with net zero emissions. And the Liberal Democrats are certainly right to point out the policy reversals following the coalition's end, which means that the carbon budgets could well be missed. Yes, there will need to be assumptions made, such as, for example, that nuclear new build will materialise to de-risk the extension of old obsolete power stations. Yes, power margin tolerance must be expanded by reducing demand through energy efficiencies. Yes, developments are needed in battery technology and storage to cope with the divergence in responses to weather patterns as regards to whether the UK is experiencing a long high-pressure period or not. Yes, more difficult solutions are needed in transport and heat, so that having eliminated coal, with the exception at the moment of China, we must now turn with urgency towards eliminating oil and diesel. Other noble contributions have highlighted the other important areas such as sea levels, farming, soils and water, hydrogen, forestation and rewilding, investment funds, biodiversity and air, international effects, offsets and actions, as well as social justice. All these issues and options for change must be identified and pursued and communicated. Government, Parliament and public life have the necessary forums and structures to be utilised. The all-party groups, the National Infrastructure Commission, the various committees on climate change, the Environmental Audit Committee and universities' academic modelling activities, abilities and research, with parallels in the devolved administrations. It needs to be recognised that we haven't developed all the tools we may need to use. We need to revisit carbon capture and storage. Tidal power still needs to be trialled and the Swansea tidal scheme reassessed. Flexibility and its costs will need to be included. Naturally, the cost of these transformations need to be borne in mind. Putting all these costs at the door of consumers and households as a way to avoid action and responsibility needs to be examined. Not to overburden consumers, but to reassess the balance with taxation. Making consumers pay is regressive. If ever there was a creative accountancy scheme, it was the government's levy control framework. The costs of delay and deferment of action must be recognised. In conclusion, can the Noble Lord the Minister map out the government's response? Will the government update the Climate Change Act to incorporate the new targets from the Committee on Climate Change? Will the government use the forthcoming Environment Bill to set out new milestones and necessary action? Will the government broaden the forthcoming White Paper on energy to set out the wide response policy developments needed? The Minister today needs to start the answers, and the government needs to use the vehicles to answer pertinent questions such as why are emission reductions year on year diminishing, falling by only 1.5% last year as against 3.2% the year before, and higher percentage in earlier years? Can the Noble Lord the Minister explain why the UK's emissions from industrial processes, waste management and even agriculture actually rose between 2016 and 2017? Can the Noble Lord the Minister answer how the government will meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets? Can the Noble Lord the Minister explain why emissions in the transport sector are higher than they were in 2010? Why electric vehicles represent only 2.7% of new car sales in the UK in 2018 against, for example, a very high 31% in Norway? And does the Minister take responsibility for the UK's sluggish transformation of the transport sector? This debate has highlighted how we need to expand, how we need to respond. It is a challenge to examine every aspect of everyday activity that the government need to reorganise and recognise the legal responsibilities that cannot be avoided.
My Lords, I will, like all other noble lords, start off by paying tribute to the noble lord for securing what has been, has been mentioned, a very timely debate, but also such a high-quality debate, and also thank him, as always, for the very positive tone that the noble, well, perhaps doesn't like me saying it's positive, but it's positive on this occasion, but he doesn't always want to be positive. I think it's probably how I want to put it on other issues. Anyway, the noble lord has been positive, and I think it's important on this, where, as virtually all noble lords have made clear, it is important that we work together, and I think we can all work together, and I think we have all worked together. And I think it's looking back at our history on these matters that reminds us that that is what we've done. I was grateful to the fact that it was the noble Lord Rooker who first mentioned my former noble friend, former Right Honourable friend, Lady Thatcher, who made that great speech in 1989, a time when I think my noble friend Lord Deben was probably in government and probably advising possibly even writing the speech. I don't know. But a great speech, and one of the first from a government leader warning the rest of the world about the dangers that were facing us. But in talking about the history, it's also worth mentioning the cross-party support there has been for the noble Lord's government's Climate Change Act of 2008, that again the Labour Party, the Labour government took through, but as the noble Lord will remember, as the noble Lord Prescott will remember, it did have support from the opposition. The opposition, as I understand it, did recommend some amendments to it, which the government then accepted, increasing the targets that we all took forward and went on with. So this government is well aware of its responsibilities under the Climate Change Act, and however much the noble Lord worries about the fact that no Parliament can bind its successor, he knows very well that we have followed that Climate Change Act. We have stuck with that Climate Change Act. We have not wanted to amend it downwards, if I can put it in that sort of way, and we want to continue with that. So I think it's important for all of us to remind ourselves of the history of what we've achieved and what we've achieved under the coalition government, and what I believe the government that I'm currently serving in is still achieving. And what we have done in following that, in sticking with that legislative framework, an ambitious package of policies and processes, has also been matched by a vigorous programme of international action as we work and invest to help other countries mitigate and adapt, and for that I'm very grateful to what the noble Baroness Brown had to say about adaptation to the impacts of climate change. And I hope, as a result, that this country can therefore offer leadership and encouragement to the rest of the world. So I do think, when the noble Lord Rooker asked for action, I can say that there has been action, and there will continue to be action, and there will continue to be action on both fronts, both what we can achieve here domestically and what we can do in the wider world, either by our individual actions or by that process of offering encouragement. I think I should also add, just to remind the House, that as the House will be aware, my Right Honourable friend, Secretary of State, has also said he will be publishing an energy white paper later in the summer, which will seek to address challenges arising from the transformation of the energy system over the coming decades. Again, something that's going to be important because, as so many of my noble friends have pointed out, I particularly think of, I think it was my noble friend Lady Altman when she was talking about electric cars, the strains that will put on the electricity system. And so that white paper will take a long-term view of the energy system up to 2050, consistent with what the government wishes to do on climate change. So, my Lords, as we all know, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change around the world, and our action has been determined. We know that more is needed. Last October, as has been reminded, the IPCC published their special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And the conclusions, as again the House has been reminded, were stark. Our current rate of warning could see us reaching 1.5 degrees as soon as 2030. And that would present many threats that have been highlighted by noble lords in the course of this debate: food security, water supply, infrastructure, biodiversity, to the ecosystem as a whole. The science is now clear, and we're witnessing that groundswell of public concern that, again, noble lords have referred to, and there's an increased sense of urgency, more vocal demands for action. And that is why we are seeking to play that role, both domestically and internationally. I want to address both of those in turn, starting with the domestic sector. Now, our legally binding carbon targets set by our world-leading climate change action are amongst the most stretching in the world. And we've already achieved a very great deal since 1990. We've reduced emissions by 42%, whilst growing our economy by 72%. Now, I know some doubts have been expressed, first of all, by the noble Lord Rooker, then by the noble Baroness Lady Jones and others, about the system of accounting. I think, though, my lords, we have to accept that is the system of accounting that we have. And to change that system of accounting, well, we can't do it unless we have agreement from all others. Perhaps that's something that could come in the future. But what we do know at the moment is that under that current system of accounting, we have reduced our emissions by 42%. But the important factor is, at the same time, we've increased our economy by some 72%. And I think at this point it is worth looking to the possibilities, the opportunities of that growing green economy. Some 400,000 jobs we reckon we have seen. We reckon it could be another, it could be up to 2 million by 2030. That sector is growing much faster than the main economy, up by something like 11% per annum. Exports worth, estimates vary between 60 and 170 billion by 2030. If one just takes it at a local level, as the noble Lord Prescott did, one looks at the opportunities for an area like the Humber, what they could achieve there and what I'm sure they will achieve there. If the noble Lord would like to invite me up to the Humber, show me what they're doing and have a look at their local industrial strategy and the opportunities, I would be more than happy to do that. But I think one should look at other opportunities as well, and I will refer to those in due course. Now, my lords, in 2017, we also published our Clean Growth Strategy, setting out our policies and proposals for further decarbonising the economy in the 2020s and the illustrative pathways out to 2050. And that strategy also sets out our investment of over £2.5 billion to support low-carbon innovation from 2015 to 2021, as we seek to realise the opportunities, again, I stress that word, opportunities, of the global shift to a low-carbon economy. And just to give a few examples of the action we're taking. In power, 50% of our electricity, and I'm grateful to the Noble Lord Lipsey for reminding the House of this, now comes from clean sources. And by 2025, we will have phased out coal for our energy mix in its entirety. And if I can just pause as a Cumbrian, because I see the Noble Lord Judd there, since there was some mention of a consent being granted for a new deep mine in Cumbria. I will say that decision has been made, but that is not coal for energy consumption. That is coking coal for production of steel, and I think at this stage we have no other way of producing steel without using that coal. The alternative would be to import it across the seas from other, possibly rather dubious parts of the world. I think it is better to take it out of the mines from that mining area. But it might be that the Noble Lord does not, the Noble Lord Rooker does not agree with me. Further, my Lords, we published our offshore wind sector deal on 7th of March, and that pledges that 30% of British electricity power can come from offshore wind by 2030. And we've seen a dramatic growth in the use of offshore wind and this again is something worth reminding the House of, an enormous reduction in the costs of offshore wind. The same we've seen in solar power as a result of its use, and enormous reductions in the cost. The Noble Lord Grantchester asked us to continue to look at tidal and mentioned the Swansea Bay barrage scheme, which we rejected on the grounds of costs. Of course, we will go on looking at issues like tidal, but I do have to say I don't think there are likely to be the opportunities for the dramatic reduction in cost for schemes of that sort, because they are largely about putting large amounts of concrete, a rather carbon-producing product, into the ground, whereas with things like offshore wind, with things like solar, there are genuine opportunities to reduce costs, and we will continue to do so. But again, there are other renewables we will continue to look at, we will continue to research into. I can tell the Noble Lord Prescott I was very interested up in Glasgow in a mining park there to go and see the use of old mine shafts being used as heat pumps. I have to say I don't understand the science of it. Noble Lord Hunt will no doubt help me out on this. But it is wonderful to be able to see that old mining areas can possibly make a contribution to renewables by making use of those old mine shafts and what goes with them. There are all sorts of other things that we can and will be doing in the way of research into renewables. One thinks of all the work that goes into storage. I think the Noble Lord Hanworth touched on production of hydrogen from nuclear power stations. One can also look, as I've seen again in Orkney, production of hydrogen from wind farms that can again be used in transport or in other things. There is research we can do into artificial intelligence, into other such things to improve the smartness of our grid, all of which can improve energy efficiency and make for a better use of power and reduce our consumptions. I could go on, my Lords, but I would be in danger of running out of time. So I turn now very briefly to my noble friend's report, and can I say just how grateful I am to my noble friend Lord Deben and the noble Baroness Lady Brown for all the work they have done in producing that report. It is a great thick square book, as they said. There are 600 pages of it, and I will make my honest confession that I have not even opened it yet, because I only got it this morning, but it will be studied within the department by ministers in due course. And I believe that we did act rightly and quickly in commissioning that report from independent experts from my noble friends committee to provide advice on that. Now, that has come at a crucial moment, and I think their advice will be worth serious study, and I can offer a guarantee that we will, and I can offer a guarantee to my noble friend that in due course my right honourable friend, or both my right honourable friends, Secretary of State and my right honourable friend Claire Perry, will be responding to that and taking it forward in the most appropriate way. My Lords, I said that I want to talk about what we were doing domestically. I think it's also very important that I turn now to our role internationally and what we are doing and how important it is. Again, the Noble Lord Prescott talked about that from his own experience. We can do an awful lot, not only by example, I referred to the history, in the way we have shown how individual countries can cut their emissions and at the same time grow economically. We can show that since we've got what is possibly the best record in the G7 or even the G20 since 1990. But obviously we can do more, and we will continue to do more with that. So first, we've offered to host COP26, which will be next year, which will be a pivotal global moment, I think, to take stock and encourage global ambition and prepare the ground for further action. We know also that, as I think the noble Lady Baroness Brown said, that climate change is a risk multiplier with a potential to exacerbate global instability through resource stress, through population displacement, impact on trade and global economic and food security. For too many people, climate change, the Noble Lord Judd stressed this, is already a matter of life and death. Millions around the world have been left without homes or livelihoods, as we've seen recently following the cyclone that affected Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. So we are promoting climate security internationally, and we're also helping governments build resilience whilst reducing emissions. And through the UK-led Centre for Global Disaster Protection, we're working with developing countries to increase their preparedness and resilience to climate change and natural disasters. And through our world-leading international climate finance, we're supporting cleaner economic growth, and so far have helped some 17 million people with improved access to clean energy and 47 million people to cope with the effects of climate change. And between 2016 and 2020, we're providing at least 5.8 billion in climate finance, aiming to spend half on building resilience and half on emissions reductions. And if I can just say a word or two about that, I can remind the House, I think this was a question from Noble Baroness Lady Altman, that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, announced only yesterday 3 major new aid programmes to help farmers across Africa and Southern Africa affected by climate change and to boost climate resilience in Ethiopia. We're also playing a key role in the commitment from developed countries to mobilise 100 billion a year in climate finance from 2020, and the UK will co-lead efforts on resilience and adaptation ahead of the United Nations Secretary-General's Climate Action Summit in September in this year. And I believe that investing in resilience not only reduces risks to lives and livelihoods, but it also offers that opportunity that we talked about to create jobs, spread prosperity and accelerate development and enhance security. My Lords, as I said, I believe this has been a good debate, and I believe that...
Forgive me for interrupting. My noble friend's obviously coming to the end of his speech. I don't think I've heard any mention... Obviously, our green targets depend heavily on our success, as indeed the wider worlds do, on successful development of low-carbon nuclear power. And as I indicated, and as is widely seen, our nuclear power programme is in some difficulties at the moment. Yet he hasn't made mention of that. Would he do so, please?
Can I repeat a commitment I've given to my noble friend before, that we remain committed to nuclear power, and I hope that I accept that we have not got the development in West Cumberland, Moorhouse, that we were hoping for, and Wilfer also went. But we continue to believe there is a role for nuclear power. We continue to have considerable amounts of energy coming from nuclear power. My noble friend will no doubt be ready and prepared for the white paper I talked about earlier on, and there will be further announcements coming from my right honourable friend in due course. But I can offer him my assurance that we certainly continue to see that role for nuclear power. My Lords, I believe I'm coming to the end of my time. So again, can I end by thanking the noble Lord, and giving him that assurance that I believe that we and all other parties and other governments have achieved a great deal, and we have demonstrated to the world how emissions reductions can be delivered whilst at the same time, and I think this is important, growing not only our own economy but the economy of other countries in the world, because I think lifting countries out of poverty will again be better for them, and there's no point us imposing a hair shirt on ourselves if it imposes an even worse hair shirt on the rest of the world. We will continue to take action here in the United Kingdom, taking our strong progress to date as a template for how we can go further, and we will help other countries, my Lords, do the same.
Grateful. It was a privilege to kick off the debate this morning. I'm grateful to everyone who's contributed. I just want to say one thing. It was no accident that at no time in my speech did I refer to any specific political party. I am not interested in Labour targets, and I'm not interested in Tory targets. We've got to get this issue transcending right across so that we don't get a gap, as we have had in the last few years, and deliver. We're on the verge, if correct, of an economic boom in a way that we never envisaged in the past if we get the economics of climate change right. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the content have it.
Lord Lansley.